Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 356 part 2. Well, there's more questions, so let's just buckle down and get on with answering them. They're not going anywhere else otherwise. Andre de Coult asks, in the time period the channel covers, when did the naval attaché get created and why? What were its on-paper functions, and what other notable functions, feats or exploits did people who were naval attachés get up to, besides buying up all the coal and oil in the region when it suited them? The role of a military attaché varies somewhat depending on where they're going. And in terms of specifically naval attachés, well, and military attachés in general, it again varies on time depending on the country in question. So broadly speaking, although there is some overlap in the two cases, a military attaché who is sent to a friendly country is usually there to facilitate information sharing, to perhaps work on developing joint tactics, and also to do a certain amount of intelligence gathering on the status and capabilities of the Allies' military, but in a, theoretically at least, a friendly way. I.e., if you're going to cooperate on some kind of movement, then one of the purposes of the military attaché will kind of be to quietly verify that actually your ally is capable of doing what they say they're going to do, but they might also provide negotiation for equipment, sales, training, and that kind of thing. Whereas if you're a military attaché in a somewhat more hostile environment, then your job is going to be much more advising the diplomats that you're attached to, hence attaché, about military matters. So if the government of the country you're in is saying something about their military capabilities or your military capabilities, the military attaché is kind of there to whisper a word in the diplomat's ear and tell them whether or not that's actually true, plus doing a little bit of spying on what this potentially hostile country's capabilities might be. In terms of when this is all created, the first, what we would today call military attachés, kind of pop up in the mid-17th century, but it's kind of a stop-start ad hoc affair. People are appointed as and when needed. Not everyone does it. And you don't really get a formal system developing on a global scale until kind of the mid to late 19th century, again, depending on the country. Some of the older European powers start off the system a lot sooner than some other nations across the globe. But I'd say from the 1850s onwards, you'll start to see a lot of military attachés as a permanent feature of various countries' diplomatic efforts. They are obviously military officers. As far as naval attaché is concerned, well, of course, prior to the formal establishment of these systems, whether you were a general military attaché, an army attaché, or a naval attaché would depend pretty much on why you'd been sent there. If you were being sent out from the UK, there was a much higher chance you might be classed, in at least to our modern mind, as a naval attaché, because you're much more likely to be advising allies about naval matters unless you're in continental Europe. Whereas if you are a diplomat from France or Spain, you're probably more likely to be advising people about land-based military matters. And then once you get into the formal establishment of things, then obviously you would have separate naval and army attachés, or perhaps just one or the other. If a country has an army but not a really big navy, or if they've got a decent navy but not a particularly impressive or important army, you might only have one or the other. So at any given point, a naval attaché might be part spy master, part technologist, part strategist, part tactician, part teacher, part advisor, and so on and so forth. And occasionally, you would also have a far more proactive role in things. So especially if you're in a friendly country, the naval attaché might be asked to help train or advise that country's navy. If it's a naval attaché from a big established navy and the country in question has a smaller or upcoming navy, then they want to learn from the bigger country. And that might also include being dispatched as an observer aboard various warships, again, if diplomatic relations are friendly enough. Hence why you get circumstances like various naval attachés being on the Japanese fleet at Tsushima essentially they're there to watch the performance of the Japanese fleet, and one or two of them occasionally getting involved when people start shooting at them. Sapper Ninja asks, if the Scharnhorst had received both their Atlantic bows and 15-inch guns, would you be comfortable pitting them against the Renowns? Assuming that we're also going to give them the bow extension that would be necessary because of the extra weight of the twin 15-inch turrets, so essentially the rebuild Gneisenau was supposed to have and then didn't have because she got kind of blown up, then yes, if you took both Scharnhorst with those upgrades and pitted them against both Renowns as they were historically, I would be pretty comfortable in thinking the Scharnhorst should have the upper hand. Now, to be fair, even with the bow extension, there's some question as to the seakeeping of the ships. At best, they would have been okay. So the Renowns would have been better ships for seakeeping, generally speaking. But ultimately, without getting into quibbles over exactly how powerful everybody's 15-inch guns are, the fact is that both sides would have 6 15-inch guns per ship, but the Scharnhorsts have armour that, at least at some battle ranges, provides them with a degree of protection against the British 15-inch shells, whereas Renown and Repulse just don't. Who has the better radar and fire control setup would depend very much on what year the confrontation takes place. Of course, Renown has a reputation as being a crack gunnery ship, which goes in her favour to a certain degree, because get a hit first, that's good, but the Germans weren't exactly slouches in the gunnery department either. Renown arguably has a far better secondary battery fit, but of course Repulse was not upgraded, so both Scharnhorst and Gneisenau would have a better secondary fit than Repulse did. And I think this is probably one of the bigger factors. If we're upgrading both Scharnhorst, but we're taking Renown and Repulse as they were historically, Repulse is, by several metrics, a significantly less capable ship than Renown. But even if you just did a 1v1 and said, okay, here's refitted Scharnhorst versus Renown, i.e. giving the British the best chance, you've still got essentially one ship which has a degree of protection at certain battle ranges and the other ship which just doesn't, which gives Scharnhorst the advantage in most scenarios where you can't somehow leverage either a temporary jump in Renown's other systems, like fire control, etc., as various radars and things are upgraded, or the fact that she's a crack gunnery ship, where you can't leverage that to specifically give her an advantage. The Scharnhorsts will generally have the advantage, at which point, yeah, you can pit them against the Renowns all the time. But you are also definitely going to have to factor in crew, not necessarily skill, because as I said, both sides were pretty skilled, but I would say crew aggression, particularly amongst the command staff, because both Renown and Repulse, for, well, Repulse's brief period in World War II and Renown's general period in World War II, tended to have captains who were very aggressive and would push for a battle under most reasonable and even some unreasonable circumstances. Whereas if you had, say, Admiral Marshall in charge of the Scharnhorst from the early part of the war, he would be just as aggressive and skilled a captain, so that would cancel out any command advantage that the Renowns would have. Whereas if you go forward and you put them under, say, Admiral Bay, which is the person in charge when Scharnhorst goes down at North Cape, he's much more, I wouldn't necessarily timid, but much more cautious, much less capable an admiral as compared to Marshall, in my opinion. So you do have to factor that in as well. But materially speaking, the Scharnhorst would have the advantage to start with. Jim Latos asks, how do you rate the credibility-reliability of Hara Tameichi's accounts? Hara Tameichi is, of course, best known for his book Japanese Destroyer Captain, because, well, that's what he was during most of World War II. And it's quite a well-read book. One of the sort of few Japanese side of the equation memoirs to be translated into English and to be in relatively wide circulation. Now, as far as his accounts are concerned, personally, and of course this is a personal view because, again, there are multiple views on the subject, I would divide what he says into two categories, which is essentially what I would do with almost anyone who is presenting a personal memoir of their account in something like World War II or World War I or whatever. And that is what they are saying about what they did, and then what they're saying about the wider situation. And when it comes to talking about what they did, I generally tend to take personal accounts at face value. At the very least, this is what they perceived to have happened, even if it's not necessarily what did happen. And at what scale you can trust what they're saying essentially depends on what view they had. If you're reading the personal account of someone who spent the entire war buttoned up in a main gun turret, you can pretty much take it as read that they will tell you very accurately how their gun turrets operated. But then if they're trying to tell you about the broader strategic situation in the theatre they're serving in, probably not necessarily the most accurate. Well, even if they could be accurate, it's not, that their expertise in their particular field is going to lend them any particular credence in that. It would have to be separate. So, for example, if you look at Admiral Cunningham's autobiography, he is much better placed to give a broader account of the strategy because, in large part, he's responsible for developing and executing said strategy because, well, he was an admiral in charge of a major theatre. And he doesn't tend to talk too much about what was happening, for example, outside the Mediterranean when he's talking about his time in the Mediterranean. So when it comes to Hara Tameichi, he's a destroyer captain. So if he is telling you about what's happening aboard his destroyer, I pretty much would take that at face value, unless there's very specific evidence that says otherwise. But once you go beyond that, then you have to start considering things with a little bit more of a pinch of salt. There are some minor forgivable errors, when he talks about some other ship in the formation that did this, or exactly which ships and how many ships were in an overall formation. There are some errors there. And you can forgive that to a certain degree because, well, he's probably relying mostly on memory, and perhaps he wasn't even accurately told what the situation was at the time, and so he was just either making a supposition based on what he could see, or perhaps he had been deliberately told that there were a different number of ships out there. That's not unusual for the Imperial Japanese Navy to actually deliberately mislead even their own captains about exactly what they have to back them up. But overall, as far as his accounts of saying what he saw during his time in World War II and what happened, I'd say 90% reliable, but just double check the details when it's not involving him and his ship specifically. When it comes to the broader strategic situation and thoughts on what the Japanese tactics should have been, etc., I would say you could probably better view that as more of a valid viewpoint on Japanese tactics rather than necessarily strictly a reflection on what he actually thought at the time. Some parts, sure, I can entirely believe that, for example, his objection to seppuku, I can see that as, the equivalent of in combat. I can entirely see that was something he very well might have held throughout the war. That's not exactly difficult to imagine. But when it comes to criticizing, say, broader Japanese strategy in the use of air power in World War II, well, honestly, at the time, he wasn't in a position to fully understand exactly what and why the Japanese Navy was doing what it was. He wasn't a carrier officer and he wasn't high enough ranked in any case, which means that any opinion that he's going to have is going to be perhaps relatively heavily influenced by what he has learned separately post-war, and of course the post-war fact that Japan lost. And therefore, as I said, I would view that more as his commentary on Japanese tactics rather than necessarily saying, yes, in 1943, Japanese officers in their destroyer divisions generally thought this. Because it's relatively unlikely that he did think that in total. And if he did think everything he puts in his memoirs, I'd be very impressed as to where he managed to get all that information from on Japanese high-level strategy as a destroyer captain in the middle of a war. But don't think I'm selling him short. I mean, you have to apply this to almost any autobiography, as I said. I mean, even with Admiral Cunningham's autobiography, because of the time that it's written, you'll see an awful lot of references where Cunningham will say, and then our reconnaissance aircraft found this. And, he knew when he was writing that, and we know now, that is a blatant lie, because it was actually Ultra. But at the time that he wrote it, Ultra was a secret, and although he knew about it, he was not going to tell everyone about it in his autobiography because, well, it was still a state secret. So, in that case, we know exactly why he was saying that, and we know what the actual truth of the matter is. But the fact remains that if you were to read Cunningham's autobiography solely, you'd never have any idea that Ultra and Bletchley Park were ever a thing. Which, I suppose he was doing his job pretty well in terms of keeping the secret at that point. But it kind of illustrates the point that just because somebody's overall strategic picture may not necessarily reflect the actual truth of World War II as it was at the time, it doesn't invalidate everything else that they've said. Necessarily. Obviously, some accounts are blatantly made up and false and unreliable, but neither Hara nor Cunningham's accounts fall into that category. Lawson Say asks, how would Italy siding with the Central Powers, either in 1914 or when they historically entered the war, affect the naval wars of World War I? Specifically, how would this affect the Central Power effort to contest the Mediterranean and the North Sea? Would it allow the Germans to bypass the British blockade through the Mediterranean? Okay, well, to start with, it's not going to help the Germans get into the Mediterranean in any way, shape or form. Firstly, the Germans have no interest in dispatching any kind of large force to the Mediterranean in World War I, and even if they did, they'd have to either somehow break through the English Channel, good luck with that, bypass Scapa Flow and go all the way around the UK, good luck with that, and whatever battered survivors of that effort, assuming there were any, would then still have to get past Gibraltar, at which point, well, again, good luck with that. It is just not happening, and the Germans know this. Apart from anything, every ship they send to the Mediterranean weakens their forces in the North Sea, and they're already at a disadvantage in the North Sea, so weakening that force is a bit dumb. But in terms of contesting the Mediterranean generally, assuming for the sake of argument that we can somehow persuade the Regia Mariner and the Kaiserliche and Königliche Kriegsmarine, aka the Austro-Hungarians, to get along for more than 5 minutes without devolving into a shooting war in the Adriatic anyway, they have the potential to cause a lot of trouble, but they would have to bide their time somewhat. The reason I say that is that combined, the Italian and Austro-Hungarian fleets obviously will have pre-dreadnoughts, but in terms of dreadnoughts, they're going to have 3 to 5 operational dreadnoughts, all armed with 12-inch guns, at the start of World War I, and by the end of 1914. The thing is, the French are going to have the Corbeys operational in roughly the same time. Some of them are already in service and others coming online in 1914. And of course, the French have pre-dreadnoughts. That includes the Dantons, which are pretty lethal in close-up action against a first-gen pre-dreadnought. And, well, let's face it, none of those navies are particularly cut out for long-range gunnery compared to the British and, to a certain extent, or somewhat lesser extent, the Germans in 1914. And then you've got the fact that, of course, Britain at that point still has a bunch of ships in the Mediterranean, some battle cruisers, some pre-dreadnoughts, some armoured cruisers, and they can send more, especially pre-dreadnoughts. So the balance of power in late 1914, early 1915, although on paper in dreadnought terms might be very slightly in the Central Powers' favour. In overall naval numbers terms, pro-dreadnoughts, semi-dreadnoughts, cruisers, destroyers, subs, etc., it's arguably a little bit in the Allies' favour. At which point, do you really want to risk a roll of the dice and, okay, potentially you might win control of the Mediterranean. Potentially you might also lose it completely. And let's face it, Britain and France, especially Britain, but also to a certain extent France, are going to be capable of replacing losses a lot better than you are. Hence why I say they kind of have to bide their time, because the Austro-Hungarians will be bringing more of their Tegetthoffs online. The Italians will be bringing the last of the Cavours and then the Andreadorias online. Now, granted, the French do have the Britannias coming online, but the Britannias are slightly behind the curve in terms of being ready compared to the Austro-Hungarian and Italian ships. And the British, although they can shake loose a few ships here and there, like they sent Queen Elizabeth to the Gallipoli campaign, which probably isn't going to be happening in this timeline, ultimately, I would say late 1915, beginning of 1916, the Central Powers forces in the Mediterranean would then have a much better advantage against the kind of force that the Allies could probably put into the Mediterranean without significantly weakening the Grand Fleet. And that would be the best time to take action, because once you get past that period, the Britannias start to come online, more and more Royal Navy ships like the R-Class start to come online, and suddenly the odds are big turning against the Central Powers in the Mediterranean once more. But with everything in a bit of a standoff, you're definitely, as I said, not going to see the Gallipoli campaign. Logistically, it just can't be supported when you've got such a major potential threat at your back. The Japanese might be persuaded to send a few more ships through into the Mediterranean to help, give the Allies a leg up. But overall, it's going to be a very, very tense sort of stalemate with a lot of small ship and submarine actions trying to whittle down the other side in preparation for some kind of more sunshine-based mini-Jutland. Richard Sue asks, "Hey Drac, in the next few days following the publication of this Patreon video, I'll be visiting HMS Belfast. My question is this: what is your favourite spot on Belfast, and what are some often overlooked locations that I should pay attention to?" I would have to say my favourite spot on Belfast is probably the open bridge at the top of the superstructure, because it gives you a really nice view of the area of London Belfast is moored in, and depending on which spot on it you are, whether you're walking forward or back, you can get a really nice shot or view looking down at the forward turrets and the bow, or looking along the length of the ship all the way to the stern. I mean, obviously this is assuming the weather is halfway decent, which it's London, so don't hold your breath on that, but I would say that's probably my favourite spot to be on the ship. In terms of overlooked locations to pay attention to, I would say actually probably one of the most overlooked locations is the old aircraft launching area between the superstructure and the forefunnel. It seems a bit odd to say that, considering it's a wide open space that you will probably walk over 3 or 4 times at least if you're touring the ship. However, that's the problem. People just tend to walk through it. Whereas if you stop and look down, which you probably need to do anyway to stop yourself tripping over, the sheer number of different raised parts of the deck and flanges and guideways, etc., from its multiple history as, an aircraft launching facility, a place for anti-aircraft mounts, a place for boats, etc. There's actually a huge amount of layered history of Belfast just in the deck in that area. And of course, don't forget that the boiler room and engine room, or at least one of the boiler rooms and one of the engine rooms, is fully accessible. Now, that might seem a little bit obvious, but because they haven't cut additional holes in the ship, actually accessing those is a little bit of a feat. If you're following the regular tour route, it does take a little bit of working out to find the correct hatches to get all the way down into the ship to go and see that. Same thing with the magazines. I do actually know a number of people who've toured Belfast multiple times and have never actually gone below the waterline because they just didn't find the right access hatch. And I would say the other overlooked areas probably are in the bow. It's a relatively recently opened area, or recently refurbished, one or the other. But anyway, it's kind of the decks below the upper deck are around A and B turrets. So if you go forward there, they've got a really good display on crew berthing, sick bay, etc., etc. Gives you a really good idea about how people lived on the ship. And also because obviously it's in the bow, you get to experience what that curving bow structure is like from the inside, which is quite fun. Mon Squire asks, in episode 350, Scott Mason asked a question on how a person with autism would do in the Navy. In your answer, you said that perhaps a ship's boy with such a condition would get acclimated. You also said that when they became officers, it wouldn't do for them to not be able to cope. My question is, what were ship's boys? Were they the first step in becoming a midshipman? Did they enter with the intent that they would learn all the ship's functions before becoming a midshipman? And due to their age, were there a set of protocols for dealing with them? I understand that in a good part of the time the channel covers, life was held to be a little bit less valuable, but I have a difficult time grasping what parents would willingly send off their prepubescent sons to sea. Okay, so there are two strands of ship's boys. There's those who will eventually become officers, in theory, assuming they survive long enough, and there are those who will become part of the regular crew. And they join for very different reasons. Now, ship's boy was also a role, but assuming that we're talking for a minute here about, essentially underage people, the ship's boy who would become a midshipman would typically be a gentleman's son, so some upper middle class or aristocratic young child, and they would generally go to sea at some, not all of them, but because obviously some people would come in as midshipmen, but when they did go to sea, they would go to sea essentially to build up experience, because remember, seniority is based on years at sea, and if you can appear on the books of a ship, then you have your time at sea. So by the time you get old enough, i.e. in your sort of early to early mid-teens, to become an actual midshipman, if you already have 3 or 4 years experience on a ship, you have a leg up over the other midshipmen, both in terms of your knowledge and in terms of the fact that you now have 3 or 4 years seniority over them, which is going to stand you in good stead going forward. And with these kinds of ship's boys, generally speaking, they would not be sort of thrown into the wild, if, as you might term it. They are usually sent aboard a ship, at least initially, which has ideally a captain, if not a senior officer, who has some form of relationship with that boy's family. So it might be an uncle, a father possibly, even a grandfather, or some other form of relation or patronage. So they would be understood to be under, to a certain degree, the care of that person. So it's not entirely, as I said, throwing them to the wolves. And the other type of ship's boy would be those that don't fall into that category, and they could be aboard the ship for all sorts of reasons, but essentially they would be there with a view to eventually becoming part of the regular crew. And those would be kind of your powder monkeys, potentially assistants to various warrant officers, the ship's carpenter and things like that. And again, these, especially when you're talking about, perhaps a carpenter's assistant or a surgeon's assistant or something, they might be either relatives or the sons of friends of that particular officer that brought aboard as a favour. And more generally, in terms of your average powder monkey or whatever, they might just have managed to persuade the captain to allow them to sign up, because there was a certain allocation for ship's boys within the overall ship's listing, depending on the size of the ship, depending on how many ship's boys you could have. And they might be aboard for all sorts of reasons. They might be runaways, they might be orphans, or their families might have fallen on hard times. And the thing is, today it might seem very strange that parents, if the boy still had them, would willingly send a 8 or 9-year-old out to sea, completely out of their control. But you've got to remember that back in those days, the kind of social safety net that we're used to in the Western world, whichever country you're from, obviously exactly how good that net is varies, but essentially in the 17th, 18th century, it doesn't exist. You maybe, if you're lucky, will get an orphanage or a workhouse, but that's about the extent of it. Maybe, again, if you're really lucky, your parish might have a poor box, but it's nothing compared to what we've got now, and also, actually, nothing compared to a life in the Navy, because, yeah, being a powder monkey or whatever, not the easiest job in the world, but it's going to be actually less difficult and less dangerous than working in the poorhouse, working in a mill, trying to make a living as a street urchin or something like that. I mean, you get fed. Okay, the food might not be brilliant, but at least you get fed, and it's probably not going to be much better ashore. You get fed regularly. You have shelter. You have accommodation. And assuming that you're not completely obnoxious, you have a bunch of heavily armed men who will fight to defend you, and you fight to defend them. And yes, there is a risk of being blown to bits by a cannonball or whatever, but coming to a violent and sticky end at the hands of nefarious people was not an uncommon fate for people ashore either. And at least aboard a ship, you'd have to, A, be aboard a ship in a time of war. Okay, fair enough. In the age of sail in the Royal Navy, that's, every other Tuesday. But also you have to actually fight in a battle, which is slightly rarer. So overall, if you as a young boy have fallen on hard times, or as a family, you've generally fallen on hard times, believe it or not, sending a young boy into the Navy might actually be the best thing that you can do for them, because they're far more likely to be paid, fed, taken care of, and alive by the time they reach their late teens and early 20s than they would be in most circumstances ashore if you're facing hard times. Now, of course, for the boys who would eventually become midshipmen, the advantages are more to do with a career than they are to do with simple survival, because, as I said, most boys who would become midshipmen tended to come from the middle and upper classes, where they could usually provide for their children. But even then, a death in the family, if a husband or wife dies and the remaining spouse is left to look after all the kids, again, sending a boy into the Navy with at least a patron, if not a close relative, to look over them, might not actually be a half bad start in life. Herr Fuschfangsager asks, these days it seems like common knowledge that Operation Sealion never really had any real chance of success. But what was the perception at the time? Were there big differences between military and political leadership and the public, or was everyone more or less on the same page? On a very broad scope, that being the Germans might be coming, everyone was on pretty much the same page, but exactly how much that worried them between military, political and public, and for what reasons they thought that, did actually vary quite considerably. Obviously the public, well, the Germans might be invading. This is not a good thing. This is not something we want to happen. For the politicians, it was more, well, you've got essentially three factors to consider when it comes to this kind of thing. You've got the propaganda-morale effect. At this point in the war, the Germans have swept pretty much everything before them. And so the idea of, well, we're next because we're right next to them seems to have taken itself into the minds of some. Then you've got the kind of practical projected potential. I know that's a little bit of an alliteration, but essentially looking at the German capabilities from a less propagandistic, more realistic standpoint and going, okay, they're obviously a modern, highly capable military. Could they, therefore, in theory, conduct an amphibious invasion of the UK? And in certain ways, you kind of look at it and go, if you're looking at it at the time, and go, okay, well, could we do the same in reverse? Could we invade France? theoretically at that point, no. But could we build a fleet and the equipment to do so? Yes. Therefore, one would assume that the Germans could also build an invasion fleet, and of course aerial recon and various other resources were pointing to the fact that yes, the Germans were in fact building an invasion fleet and intending to come over. So that's a sort of a second factor. And then the final factor would be, I would say, the most practical, which is regardless of exactly how likely it is for the Germans to be coming, since we can't discount it and it is a rather existential threat, we need to plan to deal with it in any case. And I would say that the latter is probably what's dominating the minds of the British military more so than the other two, with a mixture of the first two factors perhaps more dominating the minds of the politicians, and for the public, well, obviously they don't know mostly the finer operational details. It's just a case of, well, the Germans are now right there, they weren't there before, logically they're coming here next. And to a certain extent, you can actually see that in the way that the various preparations for counter-invasion go. The fact that you've got these three strands of, it's possible, the propaganda morale side of they're definitely coming, and the practical side of can they, will they, but what are our best defences, it shows in the army and navy and government preparations for an invasion. Because, of course, they don't know exactly what the German plans are, they don't know exactly what the German equipment is capable of, and their assessments vary constantly, and therefore what they do varies quite considerably. You've got everything from, an initial outline plans that assume that the Germans will easily overrun the southeast, and therefore defence will have to be carried out much further inland, all the way through to plans which are more along the lines of, and this is how we stop the Germans on the beaches, or even potentially before they hit the beaches, which is something more that the Royal Navy favours. And even within the Navy's plans, you've got everything ranging from, we can harass the invasion flotilla with MTBs, MGBs and destroyers, and then eventually cut off their resupply lines, i.e. not risking the major portion of the home fleet, all the way through to, we're sending in pretty much everything that we've got, and if necessary, we'll ground a battleship or two in the middle of the German invasion forces and see how they counter that. All of these things and everything in between are under consideration. I mean, even if you just look at Dover, which is a relatively obvious target for an invasion considering it's so close, there are plans for the defence of Dover. There are plans for Dover to assist in the destruction of the enemy fleet out at sea, particularly with regards to the shore batteries based around Dover. There are plans for fighting through Dover section by section. There are plans for, if Dover looks like it's going to be completely overrun and there's no point in trying to defend the town itself, how to demolish the port and then withdraw to the higher ground immediately behind it. All of these plans are drawn up. So broadly, I think everyone thought the Germans might be coming, but when, in what force, and how capable they would be, no one really knew. But no one really wanted to gamble. ACC asks, in a recent Drydock, you mentioned that modern cruise ships really can't handle severe weather like hurricanes anywhere near as well as naval warships. That made me wonder, how far back in history would a modern cruise ship have to go before their armour, in the form of their metal hull, their speed and their sheer size would allow them to travel with impunity if they were pressed into service as a transport during wartime? I think you're probably looking at a staggered degree of immunity, and hopefully you'll understand what I mean in a second. So, if you went back to, say, roughly the mid-1870s and before, then most modern cruise ships, which are capable of, the low to mid-20s of knots on average, they would then be considerably quicker than anything that could potentially try to catch them by 5 to 10 knots. possibly more. Therefore, that would give them a degree of qualified immunity because they'd just be able to outrun anything that tried to intercept them. But obviously, if they're sailing with a slower fleet in escort, or they're trying to get to a fixed position which is then defended by a blockade, they could be intercepted and they would still be somewhat vulnerable if an enemy warship got into close gun range, because at that point you do have a limited degree of armor-piercing projectiles and explosive shells, and potentially even explosive armor-piercing shells, which, okay, poking small holes in something the size of a modern cruise ship is probably not going to be the end of it, but they can set fires, and, well, there's quite a few examples of modern cruise ships of varying sizes not being that brilliant at firefighting, despite the fact they are supposed to have modern firefighting equipment and systems on board. So they would have a qualified immunity. Essentially, they could stay away in most circumstances, but they'd still be vulnerable up close. Then I think if you go further back to, say, the 1830s and earlier, at that point, not only has their speed advantage over everything increased to probably 15 to 20 knots in low wind, and at least 10 to 15 knots, depending on the ship, in good wind conditions, which is, they're pretty much, at least the quicker of them will be almost twice as fast as the fastest warships. But on top of that, obviously, now you're talking about pure age of sail, so they are capable of sailing completely against the wind, which enemy sailing warships won't be able to do. And now you're facing pretty much entirely solid shot, maybe a handful of explosive shells, but they're very likely to just detonate on the exterior of the ship's hull. And you're very unlikely to be able to get into a position to do that in the first place. I mean, even when you've got a blockade, at that point, a cruise ship could just sail upwind of the blockade and curl around that way, and you just couldn't catch it. And so from that period back through most of the age of sail, that will pretty much be the story. You could poke a few minor holes in it with cannons if you get close, but the chances of you ever actually getting close are very slim if the ship obviously has fuel and it decides it doesn't want you to get close. But in theory, if somehow someone did get close enough, you could do cosmetic damage, to say the least. And then when you get back to the age before cannon are widespread, so 1400s and earlier, then they're essentially immune, because not only are they faster still than what would count as a warship at that point, but at that stage, between their sheer mass, well, and to be honest, just size, there's nothing a sort of high medieval fleet can actually do to stop one. They couldn't catch it in the first place, but even if you had a Battle of Sluis type situation where somebody just chained together several hundred ships to block a port entirely, well, firstly, something this size could just ram straight through that kind of fleet, no problem. And if they didn't want to risk potentially denting the bow in doing so, well, just pull up alongside and you've got a fighting platform where the first access points are so far up, there is no chance that the enemy ships are ever going to get boarding to you. Meanwhile, you've got vast amounts of deck space to have all sorts of wonderful archers and people with rocks and fire pots and all sorts of things to rain down on your enemies. And at this stage, incendiary warfare would be entirely, well, not entirely safe, but very much safe compared to medieval ships, because you've got steel-structured vessels, you've got the deck space, you could set up, all sorts of incendiary furnaces and stuff, not be at any risk of enemy counterfire, and just, chuck stuff over the edge, and enemy ships catch fire, and unless they sit next to you for hours and hours and hours, at worst they're going to do is scorch the paint. Volunteer per order O'Sullivan asks, how frequent were negligent discharges of naval guns? In Ian Buxton's Big Gun Monitors, an incident where HMS Raglan fired upon British troops is mentioned, and that was not the first time such a thing happened. The possibility had never even occurred to me. Do you know what countermeasures were taken against such incidents? And was the leading cause human error or mechanical fault. So, negligent discharge of a naval gun, it comes under, I suppose, 3 broad headings. Accidentally firing the gun, period. Accidentally firing the gun at your own side. And accidentally causing major damage to yourself by accidentally firing the gun. The latter is essentially impossible outside of mechanical faults or some kind of physical defect by the age of steam and steel. Now, that's not to say it didn't happen, obviously, when shells fail, but that's not negligent on the part of the people who are loading the gun, because if they load it properly and something's wrong with the shell and cause it to detonate prematurely in the gun barrel, that's on the shell, not on them. And the reason for that is basically breech loading. Once breech loading comes in, you open the breech. Is there a shell and a charge in there? If yes, great. Close the breech up again. Why were you looking in the first place? But nevertheless, fire the gun. And if it's empty, well, you can put something in there. Whereas before, with muzzle loaders, it was entirely possible to do what they call double charge the gun, i.e. somebody loads the gun and then somebody forgets that the gun is loaded and puts another charge and shell in there, and maybe doesn't notice that the rammer isn't going in quite as far as it did the first time, and then they pull the trigger, and yeah, bad things happen. The double loading and then accidental discharge of the guns on HMS Thunderer, causing a rather big explosion, was one of the reasons that forced the Royal Navy to move away from muzzle loaders and into the modern world of breech loaders, where pretty much everyone else had gone before. So that's one form of negligent discharge. Negligent discharge in terms of, oh dear, we accidentally fired the gun, and everyone looking around, what the heck just happened? Very rare. Not impossible, but very, very rare. Largely on the grounds that most of the time naval guns don't go around loaded. So, by inference, it is impossible to accidentally fire one because there's nothing in them normally to fire. However, again, in older times, age of sail, it was more likely that you could negligently discharge a gun at random, because sometimes when they were going into hostile waters, or if they knew that they were going to go into action, or something like that, then the guns might be loaded, several hours before, and possibly occasionally even days before, although it wasn't really advisable, the ship actually was going to get a chance to fire them. Now, at that point, control of things like the flintlock mechanism or the slow match, depending on the period, would be fairly tight, so just randomly firing a gun would be unlikely. But it was always within the realms of possibility that you might accidentally discharge, especially with a flintlock, because someone might jostle it in just the wrong way if it had been primed and so forth. And negligent discharges out of nerves, perhaps where everyone is set to the guns, you're coming up on an enemy ship and someone twitches just a little bit too much towards the touch hole or the firing mechanism, and off goes the gun. Yeah, those kinds of things could and did happen very occasionally. But then that other type, like you described with Raglan, where you accidentally fire on your own people, that again actually breaks down into almost 3 separate categories. You've got times where a gun might be accidentally fired into your own ship. Now, there were usually a lot of safety interlocks to prevent this, either physical stops or gun lockouts or whatever. But sometimes those could break, sometimes people might accidentally override them, and you could end up, accidentally either spraying automatic fire or firing a secondary battery shell, in the case of turreted secondaries, into your own ship. Rare, but not unheard of. Then you've got accidentally hitting other ships with your fire. Now, or troops, I suppose, but this is where I divide it into 2. So you've got the first, accidentally hitting yourself, and then you've got accidentally hitting other people. This would be, firstly, pure accident. Now, that would often come about from mostly things like anti-aircraft gunfire, maybe the occasional secondary battery anti-torpedo boat fire, where you're firing on an enemy target, and some of the shells that have missed that target just keep going and happen to land on or hit other friendly ships in the fleet. Obviously, this is much more common in the Second World War when you've got huge amounts of light and medium anti-aircraft guns firing up into the air. Not all of the shells self-destruct at the end of their flight path, or low-flying aircraft and people are firing at them and some of the shells go past, and you do occasionally get hits on other ships. There's not a huge amount you can do to guard against that. Theoretically, obviously, especially in direct fire circumstances, you can tell people, well, look, if you're firing a quad 40mm or something and directly ahead of you is an enemy ship, don't fire. You can tell people that, but if there's a torpedo-armed enemy aircraft coming in on a sweeping course to try and line up a shot on your ship, and they're trying to track this aircraft as it comes down, the fact that that line of fire is going to temporarily sweep past an enemy ship that might be 3 or 4 miles away probably isn't even going to enter their minds. They're probably not even going to notice. They're just going to keep firing at the enemy aircraft. And then you've got the other aspect, which is deliberate aimed fire in error. Now, at sea, this does occasionally happen when people misidentify a friendly ship as an enemy, but usually the other friendly ship is very quick to say, oi, knock it off, we are actually your friends. Although if you keep shooting at us, how long that status is going to last is questionable. But then you finally get round to the instance like where you have with Raglan, where you're firing on targets ashore and you accidentally hit friendly troops. And that could be for all sorts of reasons. You could misidentify a friendly troop concentration as enemy. And of course, troops have a much lesser capability of telling you that they are friendly, at least until the invention of ship-to-shore radio. Then you've also got the potential that what you are firing on is what you have actually been told is an enemy position, but perhaps the troops ashore have made quicker and better advances than you thought were possible. So you are firing on an actual enemy position, but it has been overtaken by friendly troops. Or you could have just stuffed up your firing solution entirely, as in, let's say, your troops are assaulting a beach, and further up in the hills, further away from the beach, there's an enemy fortification, and you're trying to hit the enemy fortification, and you go, okay, right, well, from where we are, we think the enemy fortification is 4,000 yards away, and it's actually 4,500 yards. You screwed up the range. You fire, and at 4,000 yards, you drop the shells on your own troops. And you should have been firing a bit further on, and then you would have hit the enemy. So those are all ways you could accidentally fire on your own troops. Almost all the time in these circumstances, it's going to be human error. It's extremely unlikely to be mechanical faults. Now, the range might have been calculated incorrectly, but that'll be because some human put the wrong data in. Owen Woodall asks, do you consider Hornet CV-8 to be part of the Yorktown class? I've seen Hornet discussed as her own design, or as a subclass of the Yorktown class, or just as part of the class. Were there any major design differences between Hornet compared to Enterprise and Yorktown? Hornet is very definitely not her own design. I don't think there's any justification for saying there is the Hornet class. There may be some justification in saying that she's a subclass of the Yorktown class, because there are differences. But most of those differences are not fundamental changes to the ship's overall design, because they're essentially just reflecting the fact that she's built several years after Yorktown and Enterprise. Things like slightly different updated fire control directors, slightly different, better anti-aircraft fit, these kinds of things. Those are the kinds of changes that would have happened to Yorktown and Enterprise anyway, had they not been chucked into a war, and obviously then you have changes in AA armament and so forth happening quite rapidly in any case. She is essentially a Yorktown class hull. The biggest differences in terms of both mechanics and appearance is that Hornet's island structure is very different from Yorktown and Enterprise. So if you put the three side by side, you can immediately spot Hornet, because Yorktown and Enterprise's island and superstructure looks very similar, and Hornet's is quite distinct. And the fact that the machinery has some improved superheaters. So that's a mechanical difference. But, again, there are plenty of other ship classes where we have people going, well, this is a subclass because it has a slightly different superstructure. This is a subclass because we played around slightly with the machinery, but we didn't change the machinery layout or, the number of boilers, power output, that kind of stuff. So, in as much as you can talk about the county class cruisers, but then you can also refer to the Kent subclass and so forth. Yeah, I could see an argument for saying that Hornet is perhaps a mild subclass of the Yorktown class, but is still a Yorktown class overall. But then again, we don't divide Prince Eugen off as a single ship subclass of the Admiral Hipper class. We just call her an Admiral Hipper class, whereas the physical and mechanical differences between Prince Eugen and Admiral Hipper, let alone Seydlitz and Lutzow and Admiral Hipper, are significantly greater than the differences between Hornet and Yorktown and Enterprise. So I think it's fine to call her just another Yorktown class. She's essentially a Yorktown class as built with 3 or 4 additional years of technological advancement. But if as a result you want to call her a subclass, that's also okay. The almighty Hypnotoad asks, I remember reading that the Italians had plans to convert at least one Caracciolo-class battleship into a carrier in the style of HMS Hermes. Is this true? And if so, how would this carrier actually look, and what aircraft would it have used? The Italians did briefly look at turning the hull of Francesco Caracciolo into an aircraft carrier, but they looked at a lot of uses for her. It swung wildly somewhat back and forth between a full carrier, as you can see here, a massive seaplane or float plane carrier, of an idea for a super freighter, back to a float plane carrier, briefly back to an aircraft carrier, and then they scrapped it. Essentially, the problem was cost. The Italians didn't really have the money to complete her as a fast battleship, and after the Washington Naval Treaty they didn't have the permission to do so either, so what to do with the hull? One of the pros is, well, we've got the hull, it would be much cheaper to essentially finish the top part with a flight deck, and that would give us a really nice, relatively quick, quite large aircraft carrier. But even that was seen as somewhat expensive, hence the idea of a float plane carrier, which would be less expensive because you didn't need to install as much equipment. And then that fell through to the freighter option. Then they decided they didn't actually like the freighter option, and they briefly looked at aircraft carrying projects again. So yes, they did consider it, but only very briefly. And this is an approximate sketch of what they probably would have made her look like as an aircraft carrier. Now, there are a few issues with this design, which you can probably immediately flag. It just has one elevator, which could be a problem for speed of cycling aircraft up and down, although that could have been changed if they decided to carry it forward to a full design. It also has this little pop-up island in the middle for navigation when you're not conducting flight ops, which is, it's an interesting feature, not necessarily a problem in and of itself. The bigger issue would be the fact, obviously, when it goes down, that's going to either block access entirely or partially to the forward part of the hangar, which isn't ideal. And you also notice it's got trunked exhausts, funnel exhausts, heading back in the style of HMS Furious, which would impinge on space in the rear hangar. As for aircraft, well, it would very much depend on the time period, obviously. In its initial service, probably would have used some version of the Fiat CR-20 as its fighter. Don't know exactly what it would have used for a torpedo bomber, to be honest. They probably would have had to develop a new one. But obviously, as you go through in the early 30s and then the late 30s and into the 40s, you've got two possible lines of development. Either the Regia Marina manages to persuade small batch production runs for its own designs, which is possible, especially if they, in this alternate timeline, manage to pull off the other thing they were briefly considering of doing, which was converting the wrecked Leonardo da Vinci into an aircraft carrier. because then they'd have more aircraft needed, so they could order them in dozens rather than a few here and there. Or they could have done what they were roughly planning to do with Aquila and Spaviero in World War II, which is just adapt Regia Aeronautica aircraft as fighters and bombers. And the Italians, at least in the brief time they were considering having carriers in World War II, did show something of a penchant for taking fighters and adapting them to be both fighters and strike aircraft, so you could have a single type operating off of a carrier. So it's possible they might have carried that all through the theoretical lifespan of this carrier, which to a degree would have made sense, because adapting one of the better fighters of whatever period you're looking at from a land-based aircraft, that cuts down on costs somewhat, and then having just a single aircraft, some of which do strike and fighter duty and others are just pure fighters, again saves on costs and time of development, which would be very important in interwar Italy. Architect 096 asks, "Hi Drac, I've been reading about the Battle of the Atlantic recently and I've gotten curious. How much effort would it take for the RAF and later Coastal Command to get aerial refuelling to a point where long-range aircraft could have effectively closed the mid-Atlantic gap in 1939? Theoretically, it could be done. It's one of those slightly weird circumstances where the technology existed and specifically the technology existed in the UK, which was at that point a pioneer of air-to-air refueling. You can see some immediately pre-war air-to-air refueling going on here. The only complications would be, one, you would need an aircraft that had a fairly substantial range already. So, you're not going to be refueling Avro Ansons to stage across the Atlantic. A short Sunderland could do it with maybe a single good refueling, but there aren't that many of them in 39. And ideally, you'd probably want more than one, but then I suppose you could have refueling aircraft based in the UK and other refueling aircraft based in Canada. So you'd have the Sunderland take off, it would meet an aerial refueling aircraft somewhere west of Ireland, fly around the mid-Atlantic, and keep going, presumably to meet an aerial refueling aircraft off the coast of Canada, then go land in Canada, reverse, etc. However, this would entail a fair bit of risk, because obviously you've got to make the rendezvous with an aerial refueling aircraft twice in an era that, well, yeah, homing beacons exist, but navigation to meet up with those aircraft, upon which your life depends. I mean, okay, a flying boat can land and hope for the best, but even then there's weather restrictions and so forth. It would be a bit of a fraught time, I think. You'd be taking a huge amount of risk in doing so. Could you do it? Yes, but you would probably end up either losing or stranding and having to recover a number of Sunderlands when rendezvous didn't go entirely to plan. Another issue would be the fact that while you can do the aerial refueling, it is a lot more of an involved process than what you'd think of as modern aerial refueling, the probe and drogue method. Back then, it was a case of one aircraft has to stream a cable, the other aircraft has to grapple the cable. That cable then has to be reeled in by one of the aircraft, by the tanker, to get the hose, to sort of connect it to the hose. Then the receiving aircraft has to reel the cable back its way so it can get the other end of the hose, basically pull the hose out of the tanker, connect it up, and then the tanker has to make sure that, because there's not really a pumping system, it has to make sure that it's now above the other aircraft so that the fuel can just flow down naturally. And of course, even if you make both rendezvous, if any of that goes wrong, you're in trouble. So in 39, yes, in theory, you could do it. In practice, I don't think people would. The other thing, of course, is that it would demand a whole fleet of tanker aircraft, and the RAF was very stingy about sending aircraft to Coastal Command as it was. In 1940, I think you might have had a little bit more success, potentially, because what you could have done then, because in 1940, the Allies take over Iceland. And I think at that point, you could maybe base some of your longer range aircraft from Iceland and potentially from Canada as well. And at that stage, what you would do, or at least what I would do if you could shake loose enough aircraft and do the appropriate conversions, would be to send out your patrol aircraft, probably still a Sunderland at this stage, and the tanker at pretty much the same time. So obviate the issues about finding each other. You just have them fly in a loose formation, and the Sunderland's on general patrol. If it spots U-boats or is called off, it can do that. But the other aircraft is in close proximity, so that they've always got each other in line of sight or radio contact, so meeting up isn't a problem. And so the tanker would then fly for as long as its own range allows. And obviously that's another thing when you're considering the tanker aircraft. The tanker aircraft is going to have to have a fairly substantial range itself for this to work. And then when you're approaching the tail end of the tanker's range, it then tops off the Sunderland and RTBs, because then, if the refueling effort doesn't work for whatever reason, okay, well, both aircraft can RTB no problem, and if it does work, well, then the Sunderland has a newly topped off fuel load. It can go much deeper out into the Atlantic, do its patrol, and come back with a decent reserve of fuel. And then you don't have to worry about making specific rendezvous and so forth. Anyway, the slightly annoying thing is that one way of mitigating the risks of rendezvous failure would be to meet over specific islands, but the North Atlantic is relatively sparse in small islands that you could, in roughly the right position, where you could say, okay, go to this island and rendezvous. I mean, you're still relying on, to a certain degree, dead reckoning navigation, but it would be much easier if it was, like the Southwest Pacific, which is relatively speaking littered with islands, to be able to say, okay, meet up with this aerial refueling tanker at this island. He'll be orbiting over there, and then hopefully, even if you don't immediately spot each other, you can get in contact via radio and meet up. But that's just unfortunately not viable in the North Atlantic. Lord Drucken asks, during the Battle of Cherbourg, aka Alabama versus Kearsarge, the Kearsarge is reported to have deployed anchor chains during the battle as a sort of budget armour. How common was the practice of using chains as armour, both at the start of and prior to the ironclad age? How was it used, and how effective was it? So with Kearsarge, it's not her anchor chains during battle being used as armour. It's actually prepared a fair time before the action by Kearsarge. It's actually probably the most complete and well thought out use of chain as armour by a ship in the period. So essentially what they do is get a lot of chain, about 700 to 750 feet of it, and they drape it over the side, and they fix it in place in multiple locations by spikes and bolts, and cover it over. And then they plank the whole thing in as well. So Kearsarge, from a brief external inspection, just looks to be her regular wooden hulled self. If you look closely, you might see a slight bulge amidships where this chain armour had been set up. Whereas in other cases, during the American Civil War, for instance, it's much more ad hoc. And at that point, if you imagine like a curtain pole or curtain rail with a bunch of chain hung off of it, kind of like you see the kind of loose chain partitions in some restaurants and so forth these days. It was kind of like that, but with the links secured together at points so that you couldn't just walk through it, or shot couldn't just walk or pass through it. So it's a bit more secure than that. But anyway, these and other similar attachment methods were used in a very brief period in pretty much the very late 1850s going through the 1860s, because at that point the idea of armour was definitely a thing. The need for it was also very definitely a thing, because the concern and the reason why this armour was implemented was for the ship's boilers and engines, because in the early stages of steamships, at least steam warships, the boilers and engines were vertically large enough that they protruded a significant distance above the waterline, and so it was possible for enemy shot, especially if they're depressing their guns to try and aim at your waterline anyway, to blow through the side of the hull and then smash your engines, which at the very least would take away your ability to maneuver without sail, and at worst could set off steam explosions and fires and things like this. And so it was very important to protect those areas. But, of course, if your ship has been built as a wooden-hulled ship and you don't have that protection, well, you improvise, if you can. Now, it's not something that keeps going for much longer, because after that, ships actually get proper armour. But also, even if you look at the Kearsarge versus Alabama engagement, a single 32-pounder shot proved capable of severing the chain. Now, the chain did protect. The 32-pounder didn't go in through the hull the way that it would have if the chain wasn't there. But, unlike proper armour plate, a good hit by even, at that stage, a 32-pounder round or an exploding shell would sever and destroy that section of armour. Obviously, depending on how well secured it was for Kearsarge's armour, that would have been a localised destruction. There's now a weak point there. For armour that's more draped as a last-minute stopgap, that could have sent an entire link or multiple sections of chain falling off into the sea. And so it's very easy to degrade. And in any kind of engagement where you're going to take lots of hits, say an engagement between major capital ships as opposed to sloops, it would be degraded very fast. And of course, as gunnery technology progresses, by the time people are deploying things like 68-pounders and so forth, it wouldn't make a difference, because the relatively thin, relatively low mass chain, the shot would have blown through anyway. But in the very narrow window where you have some wooden-hulled ships, and particularly small ships with small numbers of guns, firing, relatively speaking, for the time period, low-power ammunition that could be meaningfully slowed down by some chain link, it was a useful improvisation. But before that time period, you don't really have the engines to protect in most of your small craft, therefore it's not really necessary. And immediately after that time period, as I said, the guns are too powerful. So it's a very, very niche implementation, but reasonably effective for what it was. I mean, in Kearsarge's case, the 2 hits she takes to her armour wouldn't have damaged the engines anyway. They hit too high. But that's pure luck of the dice. A.B. Coates asks, for the more dangerous duties that a sailor might be asked to undertake in the time period that the Channel covers, to what extent were these posts voluntary? How willing were people to volunteer for such jobs, and how often were they forced into such roles? Were they well informed of the risks, and what would navies do if they couldn't find men willing to, say, endure tropical diseases in the age of sail Caribbean postings, freeze on an Arctic convoy, or put their faith in the safety of a K-class? So, from the context, we're talking about a posting as in on a ship or going to a certain location, as opposed to specific tasks within a ship, like climbing to the top of the mast or something. So, in the cases that you mentioned and similar, it varies somewhat. Submarines are traditionally volunteer ships because of the additional hazards. Now, submarines do get a bunch of additional benefits in the time period the Channel covers. There's usually a bit of extra pay involved. They try to make sure you have as much fresh food as humanly possible, that kind of stuff. But ultimately, for the most part, submarine service is voluntary. With that said, once you've volunteered for submarine service, you don't have a huge amount of say over which submarines you get assigned to. So if you're in the late World War I and early interwar Royal Navy, if you happen to volunteer for submarines, you could get an R class, you could get an L class, you could get an old E class, you might get a K class or an M class. You're not really going to have a huge amount of choice over where you get sent. But the fact that you were on a position to be assigned to a K class in the first place, that kind of was under your control. In terms of something like the Arctic convoys, if you're in the Navy, you wouldn't have a choice. You were assigned to a ship, And if that ship was assigned to Arctic convoy duty or Atlantic convoy duty or Mediterranean duty or Pacific duty, that was just where the ship went. There might have been special provisions made aboard the ship for going into cold weather conditions, but you wouldn't get any specific hazard pay for being on convoy duty in the Arctic as opposed to the Atlantic or running up and down to Gibraltar or whatever, because at the end of the day, they're all very hazardous. It just depends which particular hazards you think personally are the worst. But if you dial back all the way to the age of sail, and you're looking at things like the Caribbean postings, again, you do have a certain degree of control over where you might be sent, but it depends. So if you're in time of war and you're already aboard a ship, and that ship has been reassigned because of need to the Caribbean, you're not really going to have a huge amount of choice over that. You're already signed up, you go where the king sends you. But in times of peace, and to a limited degree in times of war, because ships recruited for their crews when they commissioned for a voyage, you would have a degree of control. So let's say you're in Portsmouth, you're a sailor, your last ship has paid off, you're looking for a new one to sign up for, and there's a couple of ships readying themselves for commissions. Now, one of those ships might be advertising for crew because it is bound for the Caribbean. And at that point, there may be an additional sign-up bonus or something like that offered because of the known hazards of going to the Caribbean. So you would have a choice then as to whether or not you signed up for that particular ship. Whereas the other ship might be recruiting for a voyage to the North America station, or blockade duty off of France, or being sent to India or something like that. And then you could choose instead to try and sign up for that ship, or neither of them. Of course, if you're press ganged, you don't get much of a choice. But in those cases where the approximate destination of a ship's at least initial tasks in commission would be known, then you could choose to go aboard one ship or another, and that would control to a certain degree where you were sent. But as I said, of course, if the ship's orders change mid-voyage, you don't get any real say in that matter. Camino John asks, while walking the Camino del Norte this May, which runs across northern Spain, I went through the town of Pasay San Pedro in Guipuzcoa. I think Guipuzcoa? Northern Spain. I passed the Albaula Itzas Culturfactoria, which from the billboards seems to deal with historic ships, replicas, and shipwright training. Three-part question. Are you aware of this museum facility? 2, could you provide a basic rundown including any ships of note that went through the facility? And 3, will it be going on your bucket list of places to visit and film? So in order, I was tangentially aware of the existence of the facility, yes. In terms of a basic rundown, it's this kind of slightly odd hybrid in that it's a museum, but also an example of a working shipyard at a small scale. It's in the Basque country of Spain, which has an extremely long and rich maritime history. So you've got, as you can see here from this publicity photo, they are rebuilding building a replica of a small ship of the period. You might call it a galleon, the Spanish call it a nao. And in any case, so it's actually based off of a wreck that has been found, and they're building a replica to go sailing around. There's a surprising number, actually, of that kind of period replica ships built in Spain, sailing around various places. And, of course, they've got a museum on the wreck itself. They've got a museum on maritime history and so forth. But as I said, it's also a working shipyard and maritime cultural centre. So you can learn actual wooden boat building. You can do model building as well, and various other nautical cultural events. So it's really an interesting hybrid facility. In terms of, is it on my bucket list of places to visit and film? if I do end up doing a museum ship and museum tour of Southern Europe at some point, the Northern Europe one at the moment is on a little bit of a hold, then yeah, I almost certainly will be visiting this particular location. It's just a matter of compiling a list of places to visit and working out costs and time for doing so. W. Osterberg asks, growing up, I had an uncle who always claimed that when he joined the US Marine Corps in 1936, there were more New York City police than US Marines. I'm wondering if this was true, and since the Marines are a branch of the US Navy, could you help me find out? Now, he would have been absolutely correct. So I looked up a number of different sources, and it turns out that the New York City Police Department, on average, had between 18 and 20,000 officers through the 1920s. Numbers, of course, varied throughout the decade, whereas the US Marine Corps, with the exception of the very beginning, and the 1930s, 1930 and 1931, it averaged between 15 and 17,000 enlisted during the bulk of the 1930s. So if you were to take kind of a midline of that on both, so 16 and 19,000, there would be, roughly speaking, between 2,500 and 3,000 more NYPD officers in the peacetime period of the 1930s than there would be US Marines. J. Mace asks, in the silent film about the battles of Coronel and the Falklands, there's a scene where the British battlecruisers are so low on coal that crew members are stealing the chaplain's piano and then axe it into firewood to keep the boilers burning. Is there any truth to this? Yes and no. So, Sturdy's force was a little bit low on coal when it arrived in the Falkland Islands, understandably, because it had sailed a fair distance, and they were in the process of coaling when von Spee showed up. Therefore, when they built up their fires and headed out to sea, they did not have full bunkers. However, the British battlecruisers had been coaling for long enough. They had more than enough coal for the engagement. Later on, during their search for HMS Kent, they did start to run low on coal, and they had to head back to refuel. But that was much, much after the battle. They were searching for Kent because essentially Kent had wandered off chasing after Nuremberg, and they hadn't found her, and they didn't have any contact with her, so they thought she might have been sunk. In fact, all that had happened to Kent was her radio had got knocked out. But, speaking of Kent, this, I think, is where the story that they've adapted into the film has come from. So the battle cruisers, not low on coal, don't need to resort to such desperate measures. Kent, however, when she sails out, hasn't had the opportunity to recoal, so she is actually short of coal during the battle. And, being a Monmouth-class cruiser, she's trying to chase down a German protected cruiser, the Nürnberg, which is theoretically a little bit quicker than her. And so, between the need to build up the fires as fast as possible to get as much power as possible, and the fact that she is short of coal, Kent does in fact burn pretty much anything that is combustible aboard the ship in order to keep her speed up and boost her speed. And she actually boosts her speed to a point where she is actually considerably quicker than Nürnberg, manages to overhaul her and destroy her. So I think what's happening in the film is, assuming that everything is as per your description, what they've done is they've taken the historical occurrence in the Battle of the Falkland Islands aboard the armoured cruiser Kent and potentially transferred that over to one of the British battle cruisers for dramatic effect. Jack Hirsch asks, could you recommend some books on torpedo development? Now, in the rest of his question, he goes on to ask specifically about things like propulsion, depth keeping, and the early torpedoes, basically. So, in that case, I would recommend two books. From a more general perspective, and a modern one, it's probably a good idea to pick up 19th Century Torpedoes and Their Inventors by Edwin Gray. And then if you're specifically interested in some of the more detailed aspects of the development and use of early torpedoes, then there is a republished work, Torpedoes and Torpedo Warfare 1889, which was written in 1889, by a Royal Navy lieutenant, which goes into, as is the case with a lot of 19th century works, extreme detail about pretty much every working of early torpedoes, or as he sees it, modern torpedoes, for that period. Gray's also done a much earlier book on Whitehead specifically, but I think if you want a mixture of detail and broad overview, then I think his later book combined with that 1889 book is probably your best bet. Stefan Pirot asks, is there a reason you're not releasing the Drydocks via Spotify? I always listen to the Drydocks when I'm on a long drive, thus making the journey much more enjoyable, but doing so via YouTube or Patreon is a bit more of a hassle. Well, historically, it's basically comes down to two things. Firstly, obviously, me publishing the Drydock in two separate formats, one on YouTube and one on Spotify, doubles the amount of work I have to do uploading it, which, okay, it's not a huge amount, but it is a little bit annoying. The other thing, of course, is that historically speaking, Spotify has been absolutely awful in terms of what it pays its creators. And to be perfectly honest, the Drydock is actually one of the better earners for me, and this is my job. I think it's because obviously most Drydock episodes are quite long and people tend to watch a fair amount of them. The algorithm likes that, and so basically for whatever reason, a minute spent or 10 minutes or an hour spent watching a Drydock episode or listening to a Drydock episode on YouTube actually pays more than what YouTube will pay me for the vast majority of other videos that I do. So if Spotify pays out terribly, and YouTube, much as it doesn't pay fantastically for any particular video, pays reasonably well for Drydocks, basically because this is what's keeping a roof over my head, I'd be dumb to, essentially split my audience to a platform that pays worse. Now, with that said, after you asked your question, I did look it up, and apparently Spotify podcasts actually have a CPM rate that's a little bit higher than YouTube pays nowadays, because, well, YouTube CPM's gone down the toilet over the past, I'd say, 3 or 4 years. So I'm considering not moving the Drydock to Spotify, but dual uploading it on Spotify. So there should now be, at the time you're hearing this, a Drakinafel account there, and the last few episodes of the Drydock available for listening. And I'll see how that goes. I mean, once enough people have viewed or downloaded it that Spotify decides they're actually going to pay me for it, then I'll see how much they actually pay and then work out if it's worth continuing to upload the Drydock to both platforms. Michael Imbezi asks, I was reading the oral history of the first ship design manager for the Arleigh Burke class, and there was some fascinating shenanigans that went on. One of them is that even though it wasn't technically a requirement, they decided the design they came up with would have to be able to do 31 knots because of Arleigh Burke's nickname being 31 Knot Burke. Are there any other particularly amusing examples of unwritten requirements in the history of naval procurement? There are a few here and there. One of them, which shows up as it shows itself up a lot when things change all of a sudden, is especially in a country like the UK, where, at least for the most period the channel covers, the monarch has to approve the names and has a significant say in what names of ships will be. These days it's a bit more of a sign-off rather than can object, but to a certain extent the king nowadays, previously the queen, could still object somewhat to certain names or suggest certain names. So yeah, occasionally you'll see a rather comical panic because some names will have been selected essentially to flatter the monarch or equivalent head of state, depending on what country you're in. And then suddenly that head of state changes, either through death or revolution, and suddenly there's this wild scramble to try and change all the suggested names that are affected by this to something that won't get you beheaded or executed or, loss of favour and so on and so forth. And very occasionally you'll get someone manages to slip names through the net which are very blatantly never going to pass muster, like Churchill's attempt to have a battleship named Cromwell. It's like, yes, ask the head of the British monarchy to name a ship after somebody who decapitated his ancestor. Shockingly, this was not approved. There are also notes, certainly within the British Admiralty. I'm mostly referring to British examples here because this is the kind of esoteric stuff that you find from really deep archive dives, and shockingly, being based in the UK, that's where I've done most of my deep archive dives. But there seems to have also been an unwritten rule in much of the steam era Royal Navy, at least 1860 to 1950, where Royal Navy ships had to look aggressive, or at least not look passive. Now, how exactly you quantify that, I'm not entirely sure, but there are a number of notes where various officers, up to and including various Sea Lords, are looking at designs going, capability-wise, fantastic. Cost-wise, fantastic. Looks a bit weedy, though. Can we make it look a bit more angry? And I'm paraphrasing there somewhat, but although it's never completely written down, it's not made a design requirement in the official listings, there is this kind of unwritten thing of you will make the ship look like it's going to, follow you down an alley and beat you up, rather than make it look all nice and smooth and calm and peaceful. And one unwritten requirement that I would say that is from another nation that it's amusing if you're looking at it from an external perspective, put it that way, is some of the absolute territoriality there is between various French shipyards in the late 1880s and 1890s, in the early pre-dreadnought-late ironclad phase. Because, even today there's a certain rivalry between them, but back in those days, the rivalry between, say, shipyards in Brest or Bordeaux and those in Toulon was not quite to the levels of lethality that you'd get between the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy, but they really, really did not get along, and would often make decisions about design and sources of equipment purely to spite the other yards, to the point that if there was a choice and one yard was building a battleship that used a certain kind of boiler, another shipyard would order boilers from a completely different supplier purely so that they weren't ordering from the same supplier. They're like, oh no, well, they've chosen that supplier, therefore we cannot possibly lower ourselves to them. We're going to go to with this other supplier. Now, in some cases, of course, there were fewer suppliers of machinery, guns, etc. than there were shipyards, so if they were building a whole bunch of ships, eventually someone was going to have to cave and use the same supplier. But the minute there were multiple manufacturers, and in some cases even different manufacturing plants of the same company, you would see this immediate diversification, particularly between shipyards that had extremely strong rivalries. Luckily for the Marine Nationale, in the mid to late pre-dreadnought period, the Marine Nationale essentially started clamping down on that and saying, knock it off, you are going to start cooperating. A certain degree of nationalisation helped there as well. Christopher Dooley asks, were gas shells or other similar chemical weapons ever developed or deployed for naval use? And if not, why not? Would they have been effective? Well, you have, in terms of shells at least, as was mentioned in the broader question, Admiral Cochrane's proposal to essentially enact multiple levels of exterminatus on Kronstadt in the Crimean War. And yeah, he's over-enthusiastic in the level of horrific destruction to the point that even the Victorian-era Royal Navy steps back and goes, whoa, 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 whoa. That's maybe a little too extreme. And they go with somebody else. Whereas if you want to sort of fast forward a bit to the era where you'd have what you might call the proper gas and chemical warfare shells, i.e. World War I and beyond, when it's deployed on a large scale in the trenches, Almost every navy considers the idea in mid to late World War I and during the interwar period. However, of the major navies, only France actually goes on to specifically develop and deploy a form of shell that can do this. And even then, it's an armor-piercing shell with an optional poison gas insert. No one actually deploys full-scale poison gas shells. Partly, this is because there's first informal and then, to a limited degree, formal restrictions on the use of gas and chemical warfare post-dating World War I. Not that people tend to pay too much attention to this once the chips are really down, but there you go. The other aspect is simply the fact that it's not tremendously effective. If you're going to use it in shore bombardment, the problem is that in terms of shore bombardment, you're expecting to do a shore bombardment where your own troops are shortly to advance through the area, which makes it a bit of a problem, because then you'd have to equip all of your troops with gas masks, and it means you can't really use particularly persistent chemicals or skin contact chemicals, because that's going to massively impede your own troops as much as the enemy's. But in more general ship-to-ship combat, it faces a fundamental problem, which is that ships are one of the easiest things to secure against gas attack. Basically, if you fire an explosive shell and you miss, a near miss might still do damage with splinters and so forth. A near miss with a gas shell, well, a ship is going to be moving at relatively high speed. The ship's just going to sail either past or through the cloud and into clear air very quickly, which means effects are going to be minimal. I mean, unless it's a really, really, really nasty skin contact agent, you could literally just hold your breath. Then if you score a direct hit, again, if the ship is buttoned up for action and it's acting like, a dedicated gas shell, a big high explosive shell, was detonating on contact, no one's out there. In a ship-to-ship gun action, even the anti-aircraft guns are going to be unmanned because of blast effects and so forth. The only guns that are going to be manned are going to be your main turrets and your secondaries, which, by the time that this stuff is being considered, are either going to be casemates or enclosed gun mounts. So you're not really going to affect the gunnery crew. You might potentially drive people on the open bridge undercover, but again, a ship that's sailing along, you'd have to hit somewhere forward of the bridge on the bow to affect the people on the bridge. You land a hit astern, then unless the wind conditions are very strange and quite high, the bridge crew don't need to worry, because the gas is just going to be trailing out aft. And there's not going to be a huge number of people in the general unprotected areas like the superstructure and so forth. So what's the point? If you scored that same hit with an armor-piercing shell, you'd be much more likely to do very significant damage to the ship compared to mildly inconveniencing a handful of exposed personnel. Now, you could try what the French came up with, which, as I said, was an armor-piercing shell with an optional small gas canister inside, which, in theory, then means you get all the benefits of an armor-penetrating hit and an explosion, with potentially the added benefit of releasing poison gas into the ship. However, one, you have the kind of moral issues that people have with using chemical weapons in the aftermath of the First World War, for the most part. And secondly, it's not particularly likely to be hugely effective, because for the armor-piercing shell to work properly, and as it turns out, it is a bit of a problem with the French if they don't use the gas cans, because it creates a void which can cause shell detonations prematurely. But even assuming everything works perfectly, you can't have a particularly large amount of your chemical warfare agent in there at all, because otherwise you'll compromise the structure of the shell in its armor-piercing qualities. And when the shell detonates, well, you've just set off several dozen kilos of explosive that may very well destroy a good chunk of your chemical warfare agent anyway. And even if it doesn't, and even if it spreads, you've just detonated several dozen kilos of explosive and scattered, a ton to a ton and a half of hot metal left, right, and centre, with secondary potential effects of fire and smoke and fragments and screaming and steam and all of this kind of stuff. Having a small amount of a chemical warfare agent in there hasn't manifestly increased the lethality of what has just happened. It might make damage control slightly more difficult, but that's really about it. So it's not really something that would work in the interwar and Second World War period. Andrew Dederer asks, what was the logic of the mid to late 19th century trend for fitting old line of battleships with new engines and then using them for harbour defence? I can see the logic of the engine. It allows you to replace the huge sail crew who wouldn't be available, but there's still a lot of gun crews to scrape up in an emergency, and two, how long realistically would such a ship last under shell fire? Well, for the first part, in terms of scraping up the gun crews, part of it would be the fact, well, the nation in theory would be at war, so you'd be calling up reserves, you'd have volunteers, and perhaps people who were considered willing to serve, perhaps had the skills even, but were maybe a little bit too old to put out on frontline warships. So manpower-wise, you could stock them fully in times of war if necessary. And even in times of peace, you've got crews who haven't been assigned to ships because ships have just been paid off or ships are waiting to commission. You've got people on training. You've got the dock or harbour staff, etc., etc. So you could keep a gun crew set on those ships for those purposes or from those sources as well. Now, in terms of how long something like what they called at the time a block ship would last under shell fire, it greatly depends on who's coming after you. Because one of the things you've got to remember, much like in the late 1900s and very early 1910s with dreadnoughts and pre-dreadnoughts, is just because a ship exists that has obviated the frontline nature of this other ship, that doesn't mean there are a huge number of them. So, for example, by the mid-1860s, yes, you have Warrior and Defence and a slew of other ironclads in the Royal Navy, and Gloire and her sisters and successors in the Marine Nationale. However, you're still only looking at half a dozen to a dozen ships per side, and half a dozen to a dozen ships does not a battle fleet make. The vast majority of warships, even for your mainline fleet, are going to be unarmoured wooden warships. Now, of course, that trend is going to gradually reduce over time as you get to the end of the 1860s and go into the 1870s and so forth. But even then, frigates, corvettes, what will eventually become classed under cruisers, so sloops as well, and critically, troop transports, are all still unarmoured. So if you were to have some kind of harbour assault, even if it's by your enemy's mainline fleet, then the chances are the majority of the ships that might then survive to make it through into the harbour, assuming you have a big fleet battle offshore, might very well either be damaged or unprotected. So the guns on a static wooden ship, or slightly mobile wooden ship, might still be very effective. And yeah, counter-battery fire might also be effective, but at that point it's a kind of a mutual kill scenario rather than an overwhelming kill scenario. And if it's not the main fleet that's coming after you, if it's secondary fleets, raiders and that kind of stuff, they're probably still also going to be unarmoured ships well into the latter part of the 19th century. Now, of course, as you move through the 19th century in the latter stages of it, there are more and more armoured ships, and even the unarmoured ships start to carry bigger and heavier guns, which would make a fight against a block ship a very one-sided affair, even with the unarmoured vessels. And that's kind of when you start to see them go away, because now, all of a sudden, even if you do come against an unarmoured ship, it's going to have far more powerful guns that can quickly reduce you to splinters, and then those block ships go away. JJ Smith asks, are there any photos or films of all 5 Queen Elizabeths or all 5 R-class together? Most pictures seem to be 4 of them taken from a 5th. And related to that, most British interwar capital ships that I've seen together, or the most, is 9, with Warspite, Malaya, both Nelsons, Hood, Repulse, Royal Oak, and 2 more Rs, or possibly one of the Rs and Barham, at Gibraltar in 1938. Were all 15 capital ships ever together in the same place and captured in film or in photos? I don't think you're ever going to find all 15 in one place simply because of maintenance and refit schedules and the fact the Royal Navy is usually divided into multiple fleets in the interwar period. So the chances of all the battleships being in one place at one time, you could potentially find a photo of all the battleships available being in one place at one time, perhaps on a fleet exercise or something like that, but there's almost always going to be 1 or 2 in dry dock for refit or repair at that point. So you might get 12, 13 or so, but not all 15. In terms of wanting to get all of the Queen Elizabeths or all of the Rs in one place, they might in theory be present in some of the larger shots of the Grand Fleet in Scapa Flow in the latter stages of World War I, but a lot of those shots are quite grainy, so you'd have to do a fair bit of research to work out exactly which ship was which. There is, of course, this photo, which you can see, and this has 8 ships in it. Now, obviously, the lead ship is a Nelson class, but pretty much all the others seem to be the 15-inch battleships, so given that there are 7 of them, almost certainly you've got all of one class or the other present in this photo. If I remember correctly, I think it's the Revenge class in this photo, plus 1 or 2 QEs. But if you want highest number of Royal Navy battleships in the interwar period in one photo, then this extract from a larger photo in my personal collection, I think will probably beat yours. This is 12 at least. It depends if you want a higher number on if you want to count things like Iron Duke and Centurion, which are also in this photo. So this is at Scapa. So I've also got another picture taken of exactly this same fleet that looks more perpendicular across it, but doesn't quite catch the sheer number of capital ships that this angle does, even though this angle is a little more static-y, a little less clear. But nonetheless, you can see if we start with the capital ship line that ends in a carrier that's closest to the shore, there's 3 of the Queen Elizabeth-R class there. You've then got another 4 in the next line, so that's 7, again ending in another carrier, so that's Courageous and Furious, and it's Courageous and Glorious, I'm pretty sure those are. Then in the next line, you've got Nelson and Rodney, so we're already up to 9, and then you've got, I'm pretty sure, Iron Duke and Centurion, and then another carrier, or possibly an ancillary vessel. It's quite blurry. Then in the next line to them, where you've got the destroyer passing through, you've got Hood, and then Renown and Repulse. And then beyond that, in the full photo, you've got what I'm pretty sure is Argus and Furious. So, and then you get onto cruisers, and obviously there's a whole slew of destroyers in the foreground. So that's 12, including all the battle cruisers plus Nelson and Rodney. And given that there are 7 of the 15-inch battleships, at least in this photo, there's probably at least the full QE or the full R class in there, one of the two. And here's an extract from, as I say, the other photo, which is a little bit clearer, but only looks at the one side of the capital ship. You see it kind of cuts off a little bit there, and you can more clearly see that that's definitely Hood at the back of the battle cruiser line. Now, the interesting thing is, of course, I'm pretty sure that that's Iron Duke and Centurion ahead of Nelson and Rodney, but that's from a relatively quick look at what ultimately are some fairly small ships in a very large photo. if anyone wants to play identify exactly which ship is which, then drop me a message on Discord or via email, and I'll happily send you the 70-odd megabytes of scan that make up these two photos, and you can play around with adding captions. George Robert asks, I'm enjoying your book on HMS Belfast. Thank you very much. In the course of writing it, I'm sure you found more stories and information than fit in the book. Oh yeah, even with the digital interactive supplements. Could you share some interesting bits that you found that didn't make it in? Yeah, there's quite a few. I mean, oh, incidentally, by the way, if you have bought the book and you've enjoyed it, then I would greatly appreciate leaving a good review on whichever area you bought it from. Reviews on large book sites like Goodreads or Amazon always help the book, for future people to pick it up. And, well, it also helps me in negotiations for future books to be published. So there you go. Anyway, in terms of bits that didn't make it in, so there was a whole section I considered putting in that was essentially the origins of the light cruiser, going all the way back to, cruiser as a form of reference for a mission rather than a ship, and then the agglomeration of various ship types into cruiser in the 1870s, 1880s, and then the development of the protected, armoured, battle and scout cruisers, then the light armoured cruiser, and then the treaty system, and then the division after the London Naval Treaty of 1930 into 8-inch and 6-inch cruisers, from whence we get the modern light cruiser definition. But in the end, since this was supposed to be a book about HMS Belfast and not a book about light cruisers, I basically eliminated that as an entire chapter from the beginning. There were also whole sections on the exact method of working for the 6-inch gun turrets and the 4-inch AA, the pom-poms, etc., which, again, they're more suited to a book dedicated either on the ship's armament or a much, much larger book about, say, the Town Class generally, which actually there is a fairly large book on the Town Class generally, which has that kind of information, or something like Norman Friedman's Naval Firepower, that kind of stuff. And as I mentioned to someone who was actually at the book launch event, when it came to Belfast's latter career, when you look through other works and various more primary sources, like Royal Navy magazines and such from the 50s and 60s, you'll get passing references to Belfast serving in various SEATO, so the Southeast Asian version of NATO, operations and exercises and that kind of stuff, cruises with cadets and so forth. But in order to verify that, and in order to, add a few little extra details, I then had to look up those exercises in their entirety and go, okay, so Belfast was there, she was there on that date, she sailed with these ships, she did this little interesting thing happened here. And of course, all of that gets distilled down into a handful of sentences in the book, because again, it's supposed to be what I would term a mid-level coverage of the ship. So it's a step above the average guidebook or coffee table book, but it's not, a hardcover can be used as melee weapon reference either. And so as a result, I'm now sitting on a whole bunch of information about not just Belfast specifically, but also about those exercises as a whole, which in and of itself could probably be a small book of approximately the same size. And then, of course, you have the absolute primary source accounts, well, what I would term that, i.e. testimonies from people who actually served aboard Belfast. Now, in the book, you have segments from their testimonies in the book to provide a kind of a little bit of a view from the ship as to what's going on in various parts of its history. And then obviously the larger discussion. The only time where the testimony from the crew basically overtakes, and that's now the main aspect of the book, is actually around the D-Day landings, partly because, frankly, one or two of the crew gave extremely extensive testimony about what happened on the D-Day landings from the perspective of Belfast. And honestly, without just taking what they said and rewriting it with a few additions from the ship's log and some deck entries, I couldn't really do much better. So I just went, okay, I'm going to let them tell the story because, well, they were there. And hopefully that's an enjoyable part for everyone. Now, while we have these various extracts from crew, those guys, at the time they were interviewed at least, they were able to talk a huge amount about their service. So I had to listen to probably, I would say, upwards of 100 to 110 hours of interviews. And of that, I mean, obviously a lot of those interviews are covering those people's entire naval careers, of which Belfast is an aspect. So I would say there's probably about 30 to 40 hours of audio interview where they're talking about their service on Belfast. And then, of course, I had to transcribe all of that and select extracts to go into the book. So, yeah, there's an awful lot of additional stuff about what it was like to be a crewman on Belfast that physically couldn't make it into the book, because otherwise it would just be a phone book size thing, which would just be, here is the transcriptions of everybody's recordings. Which, who knows, that might be an interesting thing people are looking for at some point in the future. Who knows? But in any case, there's a lot of, little details about, petty rivalries, friendships, thoughts on the war and what was going on specifically at that time. A few bits that probably couldn't be published without the book getting an 18 rating or an R rating if you're in the US. But yeah, and I think hopefully this little segment has given you some idea of, even for a relatively modest-sized book like Belfast, just how much underlying material there actually is to get into there. Percy Antica asks, I came across a reference on page 158-160 of Before the Ironclad, which talks about some final large designs for paddle warships. But would you happen to be able to talk a little bit more about these final large designs and describe how they, or perhaps the ones specifically referenced in the book, may have appeared? I'm going to presume that you have a digital copy, because I found in my paper copy the area you were talking about was on page 68 through 70. But nonetheless, so the details of the big ship that you referenced, about 2,500 tons burthen, 260 foot long, with two 68-pounders, heavy 68-pounders and 16 slightly lighter 68-pounders on the upper deck, and then 18 of the slightly lighter weight 68-pounders on the main deck. This is essentially a big first-class frigate for the period that it's being designed in. And there's a few other designs, roughly speaking, in that area. In terms of what it might look like, well, we actually do have an idea, because there was at least one paddle warship built for the Royal Navy that approached that size, and this would actually be the largest paddle warship ever built historically, unless you include Wolverine and Sable, the converted training carriers in World War II. And this is what you can see here. This is HMS Terrible. She is about 1,850 tons burthen and 226 foot long as opposed to 260, with an original armament of 4 56-pounder shell guns, 4 68-pounders, and 3 12-pounders on the main deck, and then 4 56-pounders and 4 68-pounders on the upper deck. And yes, that is 4 funnels on a ship built considerably before 1850. And that was simply because originally she had 4 large boilers with considerable amounts of furnaces. But in the end, if you look at later pictures and paintings of Terrible, you'll see she only has 2, because they decided that actually the 4 boilers produced far too much steam for the engine. And so they removed 2 of them, halving her boiler output, but not actually manifestly changing the amount of steam that was getting to the engine anyway. And she had some quite interesting career choices. So based on what Terrible did, and then looking at these larger designs that were also available, I suspect it would have been very long distance cruising. And Terrible actually did a huge amount of cruising under engine power alone. So probably a very long distance, essentially kind of almost armoured cruiser style things, big, mean station flagship on foreign stations while the capital ships are off elsewhere, acting as a flagship and showing off, and then obviously theoretically hunting down and destroying lesser frigates as a war breaks out, potentially even with that kind of armament that was planned for them, with multiple 68-pounders, potentially even being a threat to some of the smaller, older capital ships that various nations might have. Scott Jennings asks, recently a certain East Asian nation attempted to launch their brand new warship, and things went decidedly not according to plan. Aside from Vasa, which you've already discussed at length in our own dedicated series, during the time period the channel covers, were there any other particularly disastrous naval launches that resulted in significant damage to or loss of a warship? There have been a number of disastrous naval warship launches over time. I mean, in the run-up to the American Civil War, say the run-up, the 2 decades prior, one of the US warships that was being launched at the time literally just launched itself straight into the river and sank promptly, at which point everyone kind of looked at it and went, that's not supposed to happen. But fortunately, they knew exactly where it had sunk, and fortunately the water was fairly shallow, so they were able to salvage the thing, patch it up, and it actually went on to serve for quite a long time afterwards. Another one that caused damage would be the Brazilian ironclad Independencia, which was launched in 1874. Now, launching very large iron warships was a bit of a new science at the time, but even so, the fair number had been launched to varying degrees of success previously. But when she was launched, someone had taken the genius idea of installing all her armour plate before she went in the water, as a result of which they went launch, and Independencia went nope, and just sat there. Like, okay, right, you are going in the water whether you like it or not. They got hydraulic rams and all sorts of things. Got the ship moving, and they're like, okay, right, great, it's going down the slipway, it's up to speed. And as soon as it was clear of all the things that were pushing it down the slipway, the ship ground to a halt again, ripping up a whole chunk of its bottom plating with the friction, which then obviously needed to be replaced. In the end, they had to take off a bunch of its armour to get it to actually go all the way into the water. Slight aside, although it didn't cause damage to the ship, it caused damage to pretty much everything else. In August 1939, the carrier HMS Formidable was supposed to be launched from Holland and Wolff in Belfast, and then about half an hour before she was supposed to be sent into the water, the forward support structure that supports the bow when the stern's in the water suddenly out of nowhere collapsed, and people noticed the ship was moving of its own volition. Now, granted, the lady who had been brought to christen the ship had a burst of very, very quick thinking and essentially hurled the bottle after the now increasingly rapidly departing ship, thus christening her just in time, at which point it was like, everybody run for your lives, because of course at this point people are knocking wedges and stuff out from under the hull. So everyone's scattering left, right and centre. And Formidable is just, having decided it's going into the water under its own terms, is shedding support structure and support wooden support blocks and all sorts of things, chains, etc., that haven't been loosened yet. It's all being shredded and tossed left, right and centre as it merrily heads off into the water. Now, the ship itself, believe it or not, didn't actually sustain any damage as a result of this, but basically everything else on the slipway did. People compared it to the site of either an earthquake or a bomb hit afterwards. And of course, as I've mentioned previously, the battleship New Jersey very nearly badly damaged itself on launch, but luckily for them, not quite. Eric Van Dooting asks, are you familiar with the 2013 bicentennial reenactment of the Battle of Lake Erie? And if so, what are your opinions on how accurate they were able to make it? So I was aware of the reenactment in question, and I think you could kind of split it down into two reasonable areas for historical accuracy, because obviously they're not allowed to actually fire cannonballs and chain shot at each other, but In terms of the accuracy of the ships involved, that was actually pretty good because, well, you had the Niagara there, for one thing, but there were a bunch of other ships that either were direct replicas or very, very good stand-ins for the ships that were actually present. And a lot of them painted up in period-appropriate colours. And they had the right number of ships, roughly speaking, as well, which was quite good. Now, obviously, if you're going to be very technical, you do have to knock some points off, because some of the ships that were taking part, as you can see here, were tall ships of about the right size, but definitely not the right period design or look. And one or two were actually quite large as well, but there you go. But honestly, you're not going to find several dozen War of 1812 Great Lakes era replicas to take part in a battle like this, so it's only a technical knock. You know, they found ships that were decent enough stand-ins for the purpose, so that's fine. And in terms of the actual progression of the battle, now obviously it did have to be somewhat cut down in terms of time, because the actual Battle of Lake Erie took a lot longer if people would have got bored otherwise. But from what I saw at the time, and what I recall, and from what documentation of the celebration survives, they actually did a pretty good recreation, at least as far as anyone can do, of the movements of the various major segments of the battles. Because obviously people weren't charting exactly where everyone was going on individual maps and so forth at the time. But as far as a general representation of the overall movements and the key events of the battle, yeah, it's about as good as you're ever likely to get for this kind of thing with the resources available. Fekler's Fickle Fictile Fettler, fourth finest Feckler forged for foreign fictile fettling forays, asks, has there ever been a naval engagement where one or more ships were iced in and couldn't move? And if so, what's the most interesting one? Bet you thought I was going to mention the Dutch fleet at Den Helder, didn't you? Well, I'm not going to, because it wasn't actually a naval engagement. There's the famous painting, and it's sometimes called a battle, but it wasn't. It was essentially a political negotiation where some of the cavalry rode up, admittedly, but they didn't capture the Dutch fleet. They basically rolled up, or, well, galloped up and said, short version, are you on our side or not? There's a bunch of political instability, and we'd really appreciate it if you didn't shoot at us. And the Dutch crews were just like, well, sounds fair, I guess. So they actually stayed within their cruise control. So not a battle. But outside of that, there aren't really any major naval engagements where one or more ships are completely iced up, for the very good reason that if one of the ships is iced up, then that implies that the ice is thick enough around that ship to physically prevent it from moving, which in turn means that the ice in general likely extends for a considerable distance from that ship, and therefore either everyone's iced in, at which point aiming guns and fighting is A, going to be very difficult, and B, probably going to be very counterproductive. Everyone really should be focusing on survival. But also, even if just one side is iced in, well, because the ice is extending for a long distance, up until the 20th century, that probably means the ice is just physically keeping other ships away from being able to shoot at you. And even if the ice pack, for whatever reason, ends very nearby to your ship, or we're talking about the early to mid-20th century, floating ice and so forth will extend a lot further, which will be very dangerous for another ship to approach, which in turn will dissuade them from doing so. So, yeah, as far as I'm aware, no significant engagements have actually been fought where one or the other side or both have been iced in. There is some sort of a story tale, I guess, of a British cruiser on the Arctic convoys finding itself somewhat enmeshed in ice, and while it's trying to clear the ice, a U-boat pops up finds itself in the midst of a bunch of pack ice as well, and they kind of both look at each other and go, without communicating, but they kind of both go, yeah, let's not, and focus on getting themselves free and wander off on their own volition. But thus far, I haven't been able to come across any actual primary documented evidence that supports that actually happening. But who knows, might have happened. HMAS Albatross asks, the Treasury could arguably be described as one of the Royal Navy's most formidable opponents. In your opinion, what was its most damaging act of fiscally motivated treason involving the Royal Navy in the period that the Channel covers? Oh, well, I could probably make an entire video as to why the Treasury is possibly the single greatest enemy of British national security that has ever been. But the two incidents that probably stand out the most to me would be one directly Treasury driven, the other half a step removed from the Treasury, but very much driven by Treasury demands. The first one would be from the mid-1700s, because in the 1730s, 1740s, and through to about the late 1760s, early 1770s, the Treasury had this extremely annoying habit of trying to cut down the Royal Navy as fast and as quickly as possible. You know, kind of a similar ambition to what the US Congress would do to the US Navy, pretty much from its inception through to almost the end of the 19th century, except that the Royal Navy, being somewhat larger, couldn't be cut down quite as much as the US Navy could. But the amount of money that ended up being taken away from the Royal Navy was such that not only did the fleet shrink somewhat, which is understandable in, with a decade or so of peace or more, but they weren't even granted enough money for the upkeep of the ships that remained. And that meant at the advent of things like the 7 Years' War, the entire country came very close to losing an existential war because the Navy was faced with a situation where, sure, now they're actively at war, the Treasury is willing to give them money, but unfortunately an awful lot of the ships just flat out are not capable of moving. They've rotted, they need massive refits. Forget whether they're the latest and greatest ships, they just physically can't move. They've deteriorated so much, and even the ones that can be vaguely patched up and sent to sea have to come back pretty quickly when even more problems show up. And this critical shortage of ships, and of course the huge amount of money of the war budget that's being sent to them now having to be diverted into basically catching up with a decade or two of missed maintenance, as I said, very nearly costs the UK the war. And this is a thing that will actually repeat itself a couple of times during conflicts in this time period. And of course, all of that means that not only do you have to spend massive amounts of money on emergency repairs, you also lose a bunch of battles, lose a bunch of colonies, then you have to go and claw them all back, and the war drags on for a lot longer. And thus, overall, you end up spending far, far, far more money than you ever would have done if you just paid the blasted maintenance bills. The other one, which, as I say, is effectively is the Treasury wearing the dismembered face of something else, is something called National Shipbuilders Security. Now, this is something specifically set up by the UK government in 1930 during the Great Depression, and they're given the, especially in hindsight, but even at the time, rather moronic task of saving money by removing overcapacity from British shipbuilding. Basically, the government, aka the Treasury, had decided that there were too many shipbuilders in Britain, and therefore they needed to get rid of a bunch of them, ostensibly so that the remaining few could survive by, basically reducing supply to the point where demand could keep those going. And throughout the 30s, and believe it or not, even up until a year before World War II started, well into the time when Britain was actually rearming, they were basically waiting for various shipyards to fall into economic distress, buying them out, often for very little, and then in many cases shutting them down and demolishing them outright. And in a few cases where they couldn't or didn't get round to demolishing them outright, putting massive legal restrictions on them that basically forbade them from doing anything related to shipbuilding for decades to come. And now, granted, most of the bigger yards and other things that they took over in the first 3-4 years of the Depression, so 30 to 33. But even as rearmament started in the mid-30s, they just kept on going with their projects. And this is just shipbuilding. This kind of thing was being pushed by the Treasury across a lot of British industry. And although 1 or 2 yards would be vaguely put back into operation briefly during the Second World War when it became absolutely necessary to get as much done as possible, the amount of damage it did to the British capacity to construct ships and, refit them, repair them, etc., is absolutely massive. When you consider what happened with the Second World War, how many ships we needed, how many skilled workers we needed, National Shipbuilders Security, aka the demolishing arm of the Treasury, probably did more damage to British shipbuilding through basically being spiteful morons than Germany arguably ever did with every single bomb it ever aimed at British shipyards. And you might say, well, they had to do something. Well, yes, they potentially did have to take some yards offline to ensure that, sacrifice some for the survival of all. But given that only an absolute idiot would assume that the Great Depression would continue forever and ever and ever, the much better thing to do, and not massively more costly, but only marginally more costly, but bear in mind this is the Treasury, so any extra penny is apparently evil, would have been to essentially mothball the yards. Just go, okay, look, we're buying them off you. You don't have to take a loss on them. We're just going to mothball the whole thing, lock it up, keep it in storage, potentially redeploy some of the skilled workers to other yards. So those yards are now really efficient. They've got access to really, lots and lots of workers, good skilled crews, and that'll make them more competitive. And if you wanted to be really generous, maybe even subsidize the workers for a year or two that can't be moved for a year or two until industry picks up. And that way you're retaining the yard capacity at a minimal cost to the taxpayer so that when the economy recovers and there's a demand for shipbuilding again, you can reopen them. And as circumstances would have it, when rearmament starts taking place, you can very quickly reopen them and get lots of ships modernized, more ships built, etc. And when war comes, more ships repaired, etc. But no, for the sake of saving a few £1,000 here and there, they had to physically demolish the things and, as I said, keep going when it became clear that these things were needed. And these are just the highlights, As I said, actively doing more damage to British shipbuilding than the Nazi war machine did is just a highlight of what the Treasury has done to this country at various points. Somehow I don't think I'm ever getting a job with the Treasury, but there you go. If they do, for some bizarre reason, give me a job, well, you know what they say about scuttling charges, you do have to be on the inside. Salamin Shakir asks, how did wind baffles on ships' bridges come about, and when did they become widespread? So wind baffles are these slightly odd, curved external plating bits that you can see here, which are often found at the top of the superstructure of various ships, usually from the interwar period, and onwards, to be fair. Now, as far as why they came about and when, I think it's connected. So I can't say for absolute certain when the first wind baffles were invented. I wasn't able to find that out. But when you go through various photos of various ships, and as well as that, documents where they're talking about fitting or refitting with wind baffles, it seems to all crop up around the 1920s and 1930s. And I think there's a very good reason for that. And it's to do with what a wind baffle does. And as the name suggests, it's designed to deflect and mitigate the effects of wind. And there's two aspects of that. Firstly, obviously, when you're up high, even 50, 100 feet up, like on a bridge of a large warship, the wind at that height can be significantly faster and more violent than the wind at sea level or ground level if you're on land. And so horizontal wind could be a problem for an exposed position like the open bridge. And secondly, and I think this is kind of all why it comes in, if you look at bridge superstructures of warships in the pre-World War I and World War I periods, they're relatively speaking small, both in terms of height and in overall volume. But as you go through World War I and into the 20s, they get much, much larger and much, much more blocky. And that in turn is going to lead to some rather phenomenal updrafts, as well as the fact that ships are just generally getting faster as well. So they're going to be generating their own wind or multiplying the effect of existing wind on top of that. And that means that wind striking the sides of the superstructure is now, doesn't have anywhere to go, so it's going to be driven upwards, and that could create quite a violent updraft at the edge of the bridge, the open bridge that is, as well as the horizontal wind as well. Now, of course, that could become rather uncomfortable for anyone out there, and hence these wind baffles. So yes, the wind baffles are to a certain extent to deflect wind coming in horizontally, but they're also there to take any wind that's coming upwards. And what you can't see in these external views, but if you look at a cross-section, you'll see that they have a curve to them, which is somewhat mimicked on the outside. And the idea of that is that the wind comes up into the baffles and then is deflected outwards at an angle, kind of like how the splay of a ship's bow deflects water away from coming straight up. And that, of course, then means that people can be at the side of the bridge without having a massive updraft, at best being very uncomfortable, at worst whipping things either away from them or into their faces, which is also why you have this kind of very steep angled not screen, but almost gunwale type thing, which you could actually lean on. That's actually the top part of the wind baffle, and you can actually see that on the left-hand picture there. Stuart Cork asks, what happened to HMS Furious's 18-inch armament when she was converted to a carrier? And would they have had the range, and could they have been, installed as shore batteries on the Dover Cliffs during the Second World War? The initial fate of the 18-inch guns built for Furious, so that's initially 2 guns, 1 fore, 1 aft, plus a spare, was that they were installed in fixed mountings on Lord Clive-type monitors, as you can see here, and then they were used in this role in the latter stages of World War I. And initially they were actually going to put them on coastal defence batteries, but they decided a monitor would be a better idea, because monitors can move. After World War I, almost all the Royal Navy's monitors except for Erebus and Terror were scrapped, and as a result the guns became available again, and they were taken off for use in various testing establishments. One was converted to a 16-inch gun for prototyping the G3, later Nelson's armament, and the others were also used in experimental research. The other 2 were then scrapped in the early 1930s, and the one that had been converted into a 16-inch gun by basically putting a thicker liner into it was scrapped after World War II, but it was still on test grounds for all of that time period. Now, as far as could they have been used on the Dover batteries, theoretically yes. In the most optimal configuration, they would have the range from the Dover batteries to reach about 3.5 kilometres, about 2 miles inside the French coastline around Calais. However, there would be 2 rather big caveats to all of this. Firstly, other guns that were put in place, such as the 14-inch guns at the Dover battery, had about 10,000 yards more range than the 18-inch guns would have done, partly because as 40 caliber guns, there's a limit to what you could really do with the 18-inch guns. And secondly, it would have required the Royal Navy to continue to produce ammunition and charges for 3 very unique weapons, which would be in a battery that's pointing at something that in the whole of the interwar period is technically your ally. So either you're planning on betraying them, or you really don't think they're going to last all that long in times of war. And as I said, you could use longer barrel, as they turned out, 13.5 and 14-inch guns, which could then range actually even further. And those came out of existing gun stock, so didn't require specialist manufacture and maintenance. So yes, in theory, they could have been used in coastal defences, but practically speaking, they were never going to be. John Plate asks, last summer I went to Japan, so my question is, what distance would the Mikasa guns penetrate Yamato's armour? This took a little bit of work because obviously no one measured the penetration of Mikasa's guns against post-World War I Krupp steel, but playing around a bit with various gunnery penetration tables as well as the FaceHard program, I was able to establish that under absolutely optimal conditions, i.e. guns absolutely perpendicular to Yamato, in theory, there's a reasonable chance of getting penetration through Yamato's belt at point blank up to around 500 yards. So at essentially comfortable rifle range, then the 12-inch guns on Mikasa might just make it through. Although the minute Yamato does anything like, turn very slightly, or even have a little bit of a roll that angles that side downwards a little bit, that vanishes and you're going to get only partial penetration or possibly none. Nathaprong Hong Sharon asks, how did the US Navy test the Alaska's 12-inch guns and get a result that gives equivalent penetration to their 14-inch guns at typical battle ranges? Penetration tables check out, but energy-wise, the 14-inch gun has the same velocity at 20,000 yards, but is 20% heavier. Penetration table compared to King George V looks amazing, but in range, the 12-inch is even slower while being 30% lighter. Part of it comes down to slight improvements in shell design in terms of armour penetration, but for the most part, to be honest, to break it down into a short and pithy answer that can fit into a Drydock without going into extreme amounts of complicated physics, the 12-inch and 14-inch shells are arriving with about the same velocity at about the same angle of fall. So if you think about your kinetic energy equation, for example, your V squared is going to be roughly the same. So an angle of fall is going to be, roughly speaking, the same. But then, as you point out, the 14-inch shell is considerably heavier. Therefore, its mass is higher, obviously. However, interestingly, when you run the numbers, the 12-inch shell from the Alaskas, due to it being a super heavy type, is around about 3/4 of the weight of the 14-inch shell. It's actually 76 point something %. But if you look at the surface area, now again, this is using very crude measurements, but if you look at the surface area of a circle with radius 6, i.e. diameter 12, and compare that to the area of a circle of radius 7, aka diameter 14, you find that it's very close to a similar reduction. It's just a fraction under 74% the surface area, which means that your mass per surface area is actually, roughly speaking, the same. I.e. a 12-inch super heavy shell from an Alaska at 20 to 30,000 yards is exerting roughly the same amount of pressure per square inch of impact area as a 14-inch 50 shell is. And if it's impacting, therefore, with the same velocity and a similar angle, you should, in theory, get broadly similar levels of penetration, because although you have less overall energy in the shell, you are also only having to break a smaller proportion of the belt armour that you're hitting. Now, of course, in larger terms, you would have to factor in things like momentum, inertia, structural rigidity, and overall strength of the smaller shell and such like. But in very broad terms, there's a decent amount of reasoning for approximately similar penetration. HMS Impractical asks, if all forward layout had become a standard for capital ship configurations, how, if at all, would it have affected battle fleet tactics? Would the battle line have been superseded by a battle row? I guess it depends on when, because at various points during the Age of Steel, the idea of, if you like, a battle row, basically ships engaging in a line abreast instead of a line fore and aft, were advocated for and then gradually shot down because, well, it masked some of your aft armament. But if you've got all forward armament, it makes that a little bit more viable. However, if we're looking at the time period when historically you see all forward batteries start to develop, aka the beginning of the 1920s, and you say, okay, well, people are then going to follow that trend going forward. So we're talking about the interwar period and World War II, possibly even some of the late World War I designs, then I don't think you'd see a battle row generally, and that's for two reasons. Firstly, because capital ship fleets have been reduced so much by the Washington Naval Treaty, although the larger navies do practice for full battle line engagements during the interwar period, as things turn out, obviously, there's usually very little call for battle line engagements, and what engagements do occur tend to be either 1v1, 2v1, 2v2, basically small engagements where the alignment of ships perhaps doesn't make too much issue compared to a full battle line. Okay, in 2x2s or 2v2s, you still do have ships trying to follow one after the other in some form of formation or line, but then equally, King George V and Rodney don't go into a battle line to face off against Bismarck. So in that respect, you probably aren't just going to have a battle formation per se anyway. But even outside of that, if you go head on towards the enemy, one thing you are going to be facing is the fact the range is closing consistently, unless your enemy is obviously trying to run away, which means you would have to build your ship to think of those battle tactics. So you'd probably end up with maybe a little bit more armor around the bows, at least splinter proofing for near misses, probably reshaping and thickening up forward bulkheads as well. And of course, it puts the whole thing on a timer, because no matter how much armor protection you slap on with interwar era guns, at some point you're going to hit a range where both sides can blow straight through any reasonable armor they've got, and are also getting worryingly into things like torpedo range from escorts and or ramming possibly. And so at some point they're going to have to not necessarily pull into a broadside on broadside, but at least onto something that's not a direct head on. But it does give a lot more tactical flexibility in terms of, if enemies are running away from you, you can just keep pursuing with your full battery. It also dissuades people from running away from you, because while, as we've discussed before, having an all forward arm doesn't mean you can't shoot over the shoulder at an enemy that's chasing you. If an enemy is chasing you, they can maneuver into a position where you can't shoot at them, at which point you have to change course. Now, if this is a general chase, that's not necessarily a terrible thing, but if you're trying to go on a very specific course, like say you're trying to get home or trying to meet up with reinforcements, it could have a negative effect. So although it would give a lot more tactical flexibility for ships in terms of general maneuvering, I don't think you'd see a full line abreast as an idea for general battle tactics. Although, interestingly, if we were to hypothesize that, let's say, something like Hood, being a late World War I design, is the leader of the all-forward designs. I mean, in my all-forward timeline, you've got the notional Agincourt and then the Revenge class being that, but never mind. But if we assume that Hood maybe has a Nelson-style arrangement, but with triple 15s instead, and Prince of Wales, being a King George V, is built with 3 quad 14s up front, maybe in a layout similar to what the US was thinking about at one point for the North Carolinas, then again, you end up in a scenario where possibly Hood doesn't get destroyed because the series of 20-degree turns that she made, including the last one that she was about to make when she was historically destroyed, were all to do with trying to unmask her aft guns. If she doesn't have any aft guns, she can just come in on, roughly speaking, the original heading, and both ships can blaze away with pretty much their entire main battery. And it doesn't really matter too much whether Bismarck is going to end up slightly to their port or starboard sides as they continue to close, because, well, they can still engage with their full battery, and if Bismarck tries to run, in theory, they can either keep up with her, or in the case of Prince of Wales at least, hopefully batter her enough that she slows down before that she's able to pull out of range, which, of course, historically speaking, with the hits Prince of Wales landed, that would actually happen. And if the ships are presenting much finer targets, then that lucky hit probably isn't happening. JT Daily Update asks, thanks for doing my video suggestion about the US Navy's railway batteries in World War I, but I have a slight request for my question. Could you please read out the following section of this article from the May 1931 issue of USNI's Proceedings about some of the shenanigans that the gun crews got up to in Saint-Nazaire? Of course, so here goes. The Battle of Saint-Nazaire, as it was known by the battery personnel, began as soon as the first draft arrived. The men's trades and capabilities in civil life had previously been card-indexed and had been found to include everything from an undertaker to a Major League Baseball pitcher, and many of these trades were now used to advantage. Quarters had to be erected immediately. 10 days after the arrival of the first draft, the barracks, located in the railroad yards and made from scrap lumber from locomotive packing cases, was finished. It was complete in every detail, even to the little-needed brig. The small number of men on the binnacle list spoke well for its sanitation. A large machine shop nearby, having 250-ton cranes, was used for mounting the guns and erecting the locomotives. A small temporary air plant was made from a borrowed stationary boiler, and this power was used for assembling and riveting the cars for the 6 trains composing the batteries. The construction of a siding on which to erect the cars was completed, and a stretch of track about a mile in length was obtained on which to test out the cars and to work in the bearings. Upon the arrival of the first shipload of material, it was found that there were practically no complete units on which work might be started. The material had piled up at Philadelphia Navy Yard, and it was impossible to separate it into shipments. The blueprints, showing the assembly of all the cars, were sent by special mail from the United States but never arrived. New ones were ordered by cable, but the project was practically completed without blueprints before their arrival. The task of erecting the gun cars was found to be easier than the erection of the 70-odd other cars. On no car were there less than 500 rivets, and on some as many as 1,200. The packages marked rivets were found to contain stove bolts, and it was necessary to get an automobile and search all of southern France for rivets. These were obtained in metric size, and some had to be drawn down to proper size. Another missing item was the painting outfit. Paint and spray guns were finally located in a small town in southern France, and an officer sent down to ride the freight car back with them. In spite of these difficulties, however, the erection of the cars was not delayed. The summer evenings in France were long, lasting until 10 p.m., and although the working hours were from 7:30 a.m. until 5:50 p.m., those not rating liberty were generally at work until dusk. Many high French officials visited the camp during this period to see the American big guns, but the big guns themselves seemed to be much less interesting to them than the skillfulness of the riveting gang. The tossing of red-hot rivets to a man perched on top of a car, and the expert way in which he caught them, seemed to hold a fascination for the visitors. The unloading of the ships, of course, was continuous throughout the 24 hours, and taking 14-inch guns off an old freighter at the waterfront at midnight with indifferent French cranemen manning a crane was no easy task. One Sunday midnight, one of the 14-inch guns was left hanging in the air over the USS Bath, with the excuse that the crane had broken down. Admiral Plunkett, ever on the job, climbed on top of the crane and, with a 5-franc note, soon had the crane in working order again. Thus, the work was carried out under high pressure, and the first 2 guns were ready for the front by the middle of August. Many of the items that were found to be missing were obtained from the Army Engineering Corps by means of a trade. If they couldn't be obtained that way, they turned up somehow. It is a well-known fact that in the old days, the crew of a destroyer, when in the Navy Yard, was most adroit at obtaining what its ship needed. But they were pikers compared to railroad men. It was found that when the locomotives were completed, the headlight on one of them was not satisfactory. The question was how to exchange it for a good one, but that didn't have the engine's crew stumped for very long. A French locomotive with a perfect headlight was noticed on a siding. The crew with the defective headlight promptly got up a full head of steam and started full speed toward the front end of the French engine. When they got within a few yards, the brakes were applied, the engine stopped, and the steam was allowed to shoot out from all exhausts. The French engineer and fireman both ran for safety, and before they'd returned, they had the defective headlight and we had the good one. Whether or not they ever knew what happened to their light is not known, but the good light went merrily to the front with the railway batteries. Explicitly Implicit asks, last month's Patreon Drydock mentioned a question about high explosive effectiveness against land targets. I've had a similar question about the use of earthquake bombs against subterranean structures and tunnels in the Western Pacific. Would Tallboy and Grand Slam bombs have been effective in the context of heavily fortified Japanese islands? I suspect the answer here would be yes in certain contexts, but perhaps not in others. So, I mean, a Tallboy or a Grand Slam is going to carry vastly more high explosive than even a high explosive 14 or 16-inch round. So, objectively, they are going to be more efficient per impact, regardless of anything else. However, in the context of taking out the sort of shore defences or near shore defences in some of the islands where you have this very dense, heavy, but still loose sand, which kind of eats explosive, I don't think they would have been massively more effective. They would have still had a similar reduction in overall explosive force, barring the fact, of course, that they are much bigger bombs. In that area, so when you're trying to suppress the closer Japanese defenses built into volcanic sand and so forth, I actually think if you're going to send in heavy bombers, which is what you're going to need to deploy Tallboys and Grand Slams, I think your better bet probably would have been to send in a wave of fighters to suppress enemy anti-aircraft defenses, and then send in your heavy bombers at a relatively low altitude, possibly even some of your medium bombers. It may be Mosquitoes if you can persuade the RAF to come and help, or similar, you'll see why in a second. Potentially with a second wave of either A-26s or more fighters to perform final suppression for the AA crews who are brave enough to come back out again. And those attacking bombers, whether they be heavy medium bombers or full heavy bombers, should carry either a single or multiple 4,000-pound cookie bombs. Those are the ones where all subtlety is abandoned. Here is a big metal cylinder. We have filled it with explosive and a detonator. Have fun. Because at that point, you're delivering a colossal amount of boom. And if you're using heavy bombers, then you're delivering multiple colossal amounts of boom. And because they're kind of more surface detonation weapons, they're going to be less affected by being swallowed up by the volcanic sand. And you're hitting with more of them, and the effect on enemy shore defenses is still going to be quite bad. When you're going after the more inner layer defenses, like on Mount Suribachi and places like that, where you've got these really heavily dug-in bunkers and caves dug into solid rock, that's where you bring out your Tallboys and Grand Slams, because at that point, you will collapse vast amounts of Japanese defenses by lobbing 2-3 dozen of these things into a concentrated area. The Tallboys, of course, fractionally less explosive per bomb, but incredibly accurate. And the Grand Slams, well, they're earthquake bombs for a reason. Chris Balance asks, was HMS Swift from 1907 as much of a white elephant in World War I service as some describe? If she'd been designed and built 3 years later, is there a likelihood that the perception of her would have been very different? Would rapid improvements in propulsion technology, a stronger hull, heavier armament, and better as-built fire control have enabled her to serve with the Grand Fleet? Honestly, I don't think there's a huge amount that could have saved Swift, generally speaking. For reference to everyone who doesn't know what she is, she's for World War I, huge destroyer leader, just over 1,800 tons, and she's also one of the ships that famously would have a single 6-inch gun aboard a destroyer in World War I, but there you go. But as built, she has a pair of single 18-inch torpedoes and 4 4-inch guns, and a speed of somewhere a little bit north of 34 knots. Now, would 1910, 1911 as opposed to 1907 technology help her be faster? Maybe, but I don't think that's going to help too much. I think the what you would get best out of that would be, as you mentioned with the hull, would be a sort of 1911, 1912 power plant might be a little bit lighter, which would allow you to build the hull a little bit stronger. But overall, I think it depends what you mean by white elephant, because white elephants usually are ineffective as well as expensive. Swift wasn't ineffective, she was just incredibly expensive for what she was. Now, in some ways, I would actually draw direct comparisons between Swift and Bismarck. There's nothing fundamentally wrong with Swift apart from having perhaps a slightly weaker than ideal hull. Much in the same way as there's nothing fundamentally wrong, as in negative, with Bismarck's overall design, apart from, again, a few small features that you can point out. The problem with both of them is that they are inefficient. And in both cases, what they accomplish in terms of speed and armament is actually doable on a much smaller vessel. And indeed, by 1911, 1912, the Royal Navy is launching destroyers which are 55, 60% of Swift's displacement, which are just as fast, carry almost as heavy an armament, and can actually bring more or a similar amount to bear on the broadside, and are actually carrying a slightly heavier torpedo armament. So, yeah, she's just inefficient for what she brings to the table. If she'd come into service with half a dozen 4-inch guns and 4 torpedo tubes, maybe 2 twins or something, then for the time, her armament and capabilities might have scaled reasonably with her displacement. Or maybe 5 4-inch guns and 4 twin torpedo tubes or something like that. But the fact is that for her size, she's an inefficient vessel, and therefore she can do stuff, but you can do the same thing much cheaper in other ways. Gabriel A. Hawkins asks, Admiral Fisher undermines my confidence in my understanding of naval history. I believe he's easily one of the top 5 most brilliant strategic naval minds, yet I also believe that he was oblivious to the detrimental effects of an unhinged arms race. At a time when people were suspecting that the tragedy of World War I was attributable to the dreadnought race, he was conjuring up the incomparable with explicitly stated understandings that it was the rung on a ladder of another arms race. So am I wrong about Fisher's brilliance, or am I wrong about his failure to appreciate the detrimental effects of an arms race? My reading on the man is that you are correct about Fisher's brilliance, and possibly mildly wrong about his appreciation of an arms race, in as much as he knew what an arms race could do. And he was very explicit about what could result. The problem when it comes to Fisher, how much or not the dreadnought race is responsible for the start of World War I, is that Fisher's strategy is not just naval. It's naval, it's political, and it's psychological. So he has 3 arms to his strategy, and unfortunately, even as First Sea Lord, the only one he has direct control over is the naval one. For a while, his strategy actually works very well because the government either goes with what he's saying or at least doesn't counter what he's saying. But then, if you like, he's almost betrayed by the politicians. And I think that, more than anything, the collapse of his political and propaganda side of his strategy is what makes the Germans confident enough to try and kick off a war with France, which they know will involve the UK. And now, I've mentioned this before, but I'll reiterate it again for everybody's benefit. Fisher's objective was, one, yes, he wanted a naval arms race because he was confident, and rightly so, that Britain could win that naval arms race. But on top of spending vast amounts of money building a gigantic doom fleet, he also, I think, had one of the best understandings of the human mind on a governmental level of anyone who's ever attained high office. Namely, that he basically abandoned any pretense or precept that any kind of government is staffed by anyone who has even the slightest shred of morality, or can be governed in any way, shape, or form by nice words, requests, and agreements. And he saw through all that nonsense and basically went, no, governments and politicians are a bunch of immoral, psychopathic lunatics who will do absolutely anything they think they can get away with for their own personal benefit. And most of them probably don't actually care that much about the country either. It's more about what's in it for them and their personal ideology, which is, surprisingly far-sighted. But having understood this, Fisher then realised that the only way you could control people like that was very blunt. You threaten them with overwhelming deadly force, and you make out as if you are 2 steps away from a psychological breakdown that will result in you going absolutely berserk, and not only using said overwhelming force, but using it in such a brutal way as that to get Genghis Khan himself to go, okay, that's slightly scary, maybe tone it down a little. But the thing is, of course, Fisher isn't a genocidal lunatic. He doesn't want to burn half the German population off the face of the planet. But he realizes that pretty much the only way to control the Kaiser and his government is to make them think he is willing to do so. In some ways, he's essentially doing a conventional version of mutually assured destruction, which we had during the Cold War and to a certain extent supposedly have now with nuclear weapons. Essentially, don't do this, because otherwise the consequences will be so completely and utterly horrific that you will regret ever thinking of doing that, and it will bring you no benefit whatsoever. It will only bring you downsides. The main difference between Fisher's doctrine and mutually assured destruction is that mutually assured destruction tends to rely on, okay, nobody use nukes because otherwise we all lose, whereas, and therefore, you get proxy wars and things like Vietnam and Korea. Whereas Fisher was more along the lines of, don't tick me off, don't do anything that even slightly countermands my interests, because if you do, I will unleash absolute hell upon you, and you are the ones who will suffer for it. I won't, because I have all the guns, but you definitely will. And that's why he talked about Copenhagening the German fleet, burning the fields, salting the earth, etc., etc. It's why he writes like he's an unhinged lunatic, because essentially he's just going, look, if they think I'm an unhinged lunatic and the slightest twitch in our direction, I'm just going to come in and, massively overkill everything that they have, then they won't mess with us. And it was working for a good chunk of the Dreadnought arms race. While the Germans were trying to sort of keep up with the Royal Navy, if you look into the political side of things, the Kaiser and his government are pretty convinced that they do not want a war with Britain because they are terrified that the British will unleash absolute hellfire on them. Which is exactly what Fisher wants. He has achieved his aim. Yes, he's spending vast amounts of money to do it in an arms race, but it's working. It's keeping the peace even while both sides are building up huge stocks of weaponry, because Fisher can build up more weapons, and without nukes, he can legitimately win that war with relatively minimal trouble for himself. The problem comes when you get the British government of the 1912, 1913, 1914 period which then starts to back off from Fisher's rhetoric. And they try, stupid fools that they are, to be reasonable, to pretend that everybody is acting out of, goodwill for all mankind and all of that. And so they suggest, well, actually, our response might be proportionate instead of hilariously disproportionate. And the minute the Germans see anything like proportionate response, in certain conditions we might support France, in certain conditions we might send an army across the Channel, under certain conditions, as opposed to annoy us at all and die in agony, then all of a sudden the Germans are like, the British have become weak, the British have become soft, we are strong. Essentially, they start doing a version of Fisher's doctrine. We are strong, we are mighty, we will demonstrate the absolute power of our military, and since the British are now too weak to immediately get involved and use their biggest trump card, we can hit them really hard, or hit their allies, in Europe, drive them away, and either the British get involved and get overwhelmed because we have the momentum, or they get scared and they don't get involved at all. And so now, of course, the thing is, that kind of brinkmanship only works if you absolutely definitely have the advantage and the other side believes that you have the advantage. And in 1914, the Germans think they have that advantage, i.e. a combination of overwhelming strength on land, and they think the British are too spineless to get involved. But the British don't agree with that, and you get World War I. Whereas 2 years earlier, the Germans were just sitting there going, don't annoy Fisher, he'll come and kill us all, and 6 generations of our descendants. So I think when you're looking at incomparable and the other stuff he's conjuring up in the middle of World War I, what Fisher is kind of doing is he's going, look, okay, you didn't listen to me properly the first time. Here are the tools you need to re-implement my strategy the next time. And then, of course, that doesn't happen either, but there you go. If you want to simplify it, basically, Fisher was the rhetorical equivalent of a massive dog that you might own, who, at the slightest sign of an intruder, hurls themselves against the door or the fence, barking, snarling, looking like it wants to rip your limb off. But in actual fact, as soon as the intruder has run screaming from the premises, comes back, gives your baby a lick, settles down and curls up next to them and wouldn't actually harm a hair on their head. That's Fisher. What the British government did was the equivalent of sticking a "actually our dog is really friendly, don't mind him" sign up on the front door. Morons. Yokosuka Girls Marine High School training vessel Harakaze asks, 2025 marks the 100th anniversary of HMS Victory floating in a dry dock. Recently, therefore, I've been watching a lot of period stuff, including Pathé newsreels of the refloat and then pumping out. In the 1918 movie, silent movie that is, Nelson, the story of England's immortal naval hero, at the end, Victory is depicted in a heart shape floating in Portsmouth and looking magnificent with colours flying, just as a modern ship goes steaming past. What class of ship is it, and what sort of work did it do? Incidentally, if you want a really nice, really wide bit of artwork showing Victory just as she goes into dry dock in the 20s, check out my website, drukinfl.co.uk, where there's a limited edition run of a bit of artwork that I commissioned that shows that exact moment. But in any case, the craft we see in this picture is a P-class, either coastal sloop, small coastal destroyer, or patrol boat, depending on which particular categorization you want to use for them. Some of them were also converted into Q ships. This one obviously has not been. But they're small craft, a little bit over 600 tons, designed for close-in coastal work, convoy escort, anti-sub operations, that kind of thing. Very minimal gun armament, but do carry a couple of 14-inch torpedoes just in case they come across anything particularly big and threatening that isn't a sub. And here's what one looks like in slightly better detail. They're very distinctive from period British destroyers. Obviously, you've only got the one high-mounted 4-inch gun, very, very low freeboard, and this rather distinctive sloping stern that initially makes it look almost a bit like a mine layer. And then, of course, because it's only going 20 knots, it's only got the single small funnel there just aft of the mast. And at the time that that film is shot, that's actually a pretty new ship. They'd only been in service for a couple of years at that point. Salami Sales Express asks, Drac, at the Everhart Museum in Scranton, Pennsylvania, there's a 10-inch shell from USS Maine on a plinth outside the museum. If this shell was suddenly given the muzzle velocity of its host weapon at its currently displayed angle, where would it impact? Well, this one was a bit of a doozy for two reasons. Firstly, it's at a very, very, very shallow angle. I made it out to be around about 2 degrees in the end. And secondly, good luck finding a range table for the Maine's 10-inch gun. Now, there is a range table for a 10-inch gun, generally from 1935, but that is a range table for the longer barrel 10-inch gun found on later US armoured cruisers, and it only starts at 10,000 yards. Which is about 5 and a bit degrees of elevation. Whereas, eventually I was able to track down and cobble together an approximate range table for this kind of extremely low elevation. And with caveats that, of course, it's therefore not a precise science, it comes down to at about 2 degrees of elevation, and you're looking at around about 4,500 yards range, which is just over 2.5 miles. Which means that, obviously, given its location, if it was fired, as with most of these things, the first thing it would do would be smash into buildings and destroy them. But if we assume a perfectly flat, level playing field for it all the way to its final destination, it would wind up about 4,500 yards to kind of roughly the northwest, which would be in West Scranton's Cathedral Cemetery, of all places. So actually, I think this is one of the first times that firing a gun or shell in a preserved location wouldn't cause a mass casualty event. Christopher Dent asks, the demand for landing craft and landing ships in World War II seems to be rather cyclical. What would the thousands of Allied landing craft and ships be doing in between major amphibious landings, for example, after Salerno and Anzio but before D-Day? And what did the thousands of amphibious craft do from D-Day until the end of the war in Europe? So it depends on the landing craft, but it would be a mixture of things. Some would just be in big flotillas in harbours, being maintained and overhauled, being made ready for the next big invasion. Others would be conducting training, either for crews to operate them or for the troops in preparation for the next big landing event. And some would be being shuttled back and forth, because you've got to remember that it's not just the European landing operations. There are landing operations in the Pacific going on at the same time. Quite literally, in some cases, one of the really, really big US amphibious landing operations in the Pacific kicks off only a matter of days after the Normandy landings do. And some of these craft will be being used in secondary roles. So they'll be using to perhaps move cargo and men and supplies around because, well, they're quite handy for that. Some will be, for example, after D-Day, will be being used in follow-up operations along the coast and in some cases on rivers. And as I said, a bunch will be being moved across to different theatres. So, yeah, there's a lot of different fates that a landing craft could have after a major amphibious operation. Matt Kidd asks, how long would a gun barrel have to be to slow down a projectile from friction rather than add to its velocity? I don't know for sure, but it would be far longer than any practical length because, well, two things. Firstly, once you start extending a gun barrel of a big naval gun out beyond 55 to 60 calibers, you will start to encounter significant issues with the barrel drooping under its own weight, which is going to stop a projectile short through the bend, causing friction other than just as the shell progresses down the barrel a lot quicker, and obviously problems with premature detonation or detonation of the entire gun barrel much, much sooner than you're going to get a gun barrel that's long enough for the shell just to slow down through the friction between the driving band and the barrel, or the rifling to be more precise. That's why, for example, when you see that really long harp cannon, it's braced part way up to prevent that kind of thing. The other thing is, even before you get to the point of the harp gun, if you're using standard charges, the thing that's going to start to slow your projectile down somewhat isn't even going to be friction. It's going to be the blast from the charge itself, because obviously when you set off the charge, it results in a pressure buildup. That pressure buildup then pushes the shell along, and as combustion continues, the pressure continues to build, which continues to push the shell, and so on until it exits the barrel. The thing is, if you start to extend the gun barrel into the sort of 60, 70, 80 caliber range, unless you start including more and more charge proportionally to the shell, you're going to start to hit a point where obviously the expanding gases are occupying more and more volume. The shell is accelerating, but then at some point, as the combustion process, or the initial major combustion process that generates the most energy and expansion, starts to complete, either the pressure will start to drop as you have a given amount of energy within a volume, and the volume is expanding, therefore pressure must drop, or at least the pressure starts to decrease, as in the pressure increase starts to slow down, because the rising energy is less than the expansion rate. But in either case, that's going to create a certain amount of, if you like, suction drag, which is going to start to slow the shell down, which is another reason why things like the harp gun use ridiculous charges compared to a regular 16-inch gun. So that is going to slow you down a lot sooner than friction will. Alfred Wilmore asks, how many targets could a ship in World War I or World War II effectively engage? I play a war game in which ships are given one attack per battery and wanted to know how well this approximates the truth, or how ships' batteries, especially secondaries, responded when faced with plentiful targets. Well, it depends on how you want to count effectively engage, as in effectively as it can actually fire with some modicum of a chance of hitting, or effectively as in can actually fire at target with at least not an order of magnitude depreciation in the chances of hitting. So is it basically, the first option is, yes, we can technically aim at that target and we might hit it, versus yes, we can actually aim at that target with a reasonable chance of hitting it. Now, obviously, World War II ships in that case will be able to engage effectively more targets than a World War I ship. Very technically speaking, every single turret and gun on a World War I ship could engage a different target, because they'll have sighting hoods in each turret, and with the secondaries, for the most part of World War I, they're being manually aimed anyway. So every gun crew on a secondary gun can just go, oh, well, I'm going to shoot at this target. And as I said, each turret theoretically can engage a separate target as well. However, they're not likely to hit all that much, because ultimately they will just have, basic sighting hoods, maybe with the main turrets, maybe a small rangefinder they can rustle up out of somewhere. But they're not going to all have access to fire control computers. And that's the main thing. Essentially, how many fire control computers do you have? If you only have the one master fire control computer, then you can only really effectively engage one target with your main battery, and your secondaries by World War II will have their own rangefinders and target fire control systems and so forth, so they can engage a different target. But you then have levels of granularity between the World War I scenario and the World War II scenario, because if, for example, you tour an Iowa-class battleship, you'll find that they'll either have open both, or at least a map that shows both, plotting rooms. So you have two completely separate full plotting rooms with full fire control computers for the main battery. And other World War II battleships are similar. They'll have a backup plotting room. But, of course, this means that both systems can be engaged simultaneously, because, again, if you look through closely at the various systems, there'll be lockouts to control certain turrets and to receive data from certain rangefinders and radar systems. So you could configure, in this case an Iowa class, to, let's say, engage one target with its forward guns, and another target with its aft guns. And of course, the secondaries can each independently engage targets at this point because, well, they're dual purpose, so they need to be able to shoot at different anti-aircraft targets. But that also correlates to shooting at surface targets. They again have a couple of different rangefinder and fire control systems mounted for the purpose, but each turret, in this case, or mount, can target an individual ship if it wants to. And then beyond that, each turret in a World War II ship, like you can see here with the Littorios, will usually have its own rangefinder sets, although in some ships the foremost turret has its rangefinder set removed because of seakeeping issues and so forth later on, but generally they start all having rangefinders, and in some cases they'll all have a miniature fire control computer, obviously not as capable as the full one, but still reasonably good. In other cases, for example, you might have the super firing turret with a computer, and that'll be linked to both forward turrets or both aft turrets. So depending on how your ship is equipped, then again, theoretically, as long as you've got rangefinders, you can engage with each turret. But in terms of practical, accurate gunfire, if each turret has its own mini fire control computer, then each turret can engage its own separate target, whereas if they're linked, then realistically pairs of turrets would be engaging. So in the war game that you are playing, where each ship gets one attack per battery and they can split fire between multiple targets, in theory this is realistic for the more advanced World War II era capital ships, but if you have a ship that has, let's say, 3 or 4 turrets or more, then if you're going to engage a separate target with each battery, you are at some point going to be relying on the individual fire control computers within the turret of those ships, which is going to give you a slight degradation in accuracy. So with an Iowa class, for instance, you could engage 2 targets with full accuracy using the 2 plotting rooms, so using 2 of your turrets. But then if you want to engage a third target with a third turret at the same time, that turret's going to have to go under local control and use its own fire control system, which will have a slight accuracy penalty. Kyla Stern asks, what are the typical kinds of speeds that you could reach in an age of sail ship, let's say in moderate or strong winds? Did it vary much between ships of the line and frigates? And how does that speed compare to galleys and galleasses of the Mediterranean in the Renaissance? Well, if we're talking classic Mediterranean galleys and galleasses, like, say, the Battle of Lepanto, everything is faster than a galleass. The galleass was not renowned for its speed in any way, shape or form. The pretty much only 2 things the galleass brought to the party was, in a Mediterranean context, a vast amount of firepower compared to galleys, and in a Atlantic-Northern European context, well, didn't bring a huge amount other than the fact that it could maneuver independent of the wind, which was sometimes a useful feature. But galleasses generally were otherwise not particularly swift and not even really particularly agile unless your opponent was completely becalmed, because they were essentially big mobile gun batteries that happened to have oars. Now, if we're looking at Age of Sail warships and the galleys of the Mediterranean, they all have a roughly similar top speed, assuming that we're not talking about some ship that is uniquely well designed and commanded. Then, under typical conditions, if you're looking at an ideal wind, then you could probably expect somewhere between 9 to 12 knots, depending on the ship. The galleys, if they're being rowed, will hit 7 to 8 knots usually, but under a good wind, a galley could get up to 11 to 12 knots. Likewise, a frigate could reasonably get up to 11 to 12 knots, assuming it's trimmed properly and isn't fouled. But a ship of the line, at least a decently built one, a third rate or a good first rate, can still hit 10 to 11 knots relatively comfortably in a good strong wind. But the thing is, what is an ideal wind varies between the ships. Now, of course, obviously a flat calm, but with somehow a lot of wind, or a very mild sea with a lot of wind, is good for these ships. A galley is going to suffer the most as the sea starts to get choppier because, of course, it is the lightest built. But then a frigate will also begin to suffer as the winds build and the seas build. So a frigate can usually easily outpace a ship of the line in calm to moderate-ish winds. But as the winds head over towards the strong side and the sea starts to become rougher and rougher, the frigate's speed will actually start to slow down generally because it's smaller, lighter built. It has to ride up and down the waves. It loses a lot of energy to that. And usually a frigate's sail rig won't be quite as strongly built as a ship of the line. Whereas in a marginal window between, more than a frigate can comfortably handle, but less than so bad that anything sail-powered has to start hauling in lines, a ship of the line can actually go faster than a frigate for that weather condition. So a frigate might be slowed back down to 8 or 9 knots, let's say, for sake of argument, but a good ship of the line might still be doing 10 or 11 knots, and the speed differential might be even greater than that. Victory at one point chased down an enemy frigate in those kind of rough weather conditions, and this was one of the reasons why Raze frigates that the Royal Navy introduced were so dangerous to, well, pretty much anything that wasn't a full-scale ship of the line, but especially to the American super frigates, because a Raze was quite literally a ship of the line cut down by a deck, which meant that you had the reduction in weight of a frigate, but you still had the full hull strength and the full sail area and rigging strength of a ship of the line. Now, overall, that did mean the Raze frigates were slightly heavier than, Good Constitution, let's say, which meant that in a moderate breeze, usually the American frigate would be able to match or exceed their speed, but if the wind really got up and the seas got really rough, the Raze would start to very quickly overhaul even an American super frigate. But for all this, we're talking about, average to decently designed ships in the frigate and ship of the line category. If you have a really, really well-designed ship, or a uniquely capable one for some other reason, then frigates will be the absolute fastest, and the absolute best and fastest frigates in, moderate to verging on high winds could easily push 14 knots or so if they were in ideal circumstances. Wade Enyart asks, has there ever been an attempt to make a movie of the adventure of USS Marblehead, let alone a Battle of Samar or Leyte Gulf in general one? As far as I'm aware, I don't think anyone has tried to make a movie about the adventure of USS Marblehead, which is a pity because it is a very good story, but I think it's just not widely enough known for standard Hollywood execs to grab the story and run with it. As far as Samar or Leyte Gulf in general is concerned, I mean, outside of obviously wartime propaganda movies and short clips, which there are a few of, I think Leyte Gulf is probably too big of a subject to cover in a single movie because you've got the landings, you've got the prelude, and then you've got the big 3 battles that happen in very close proximity, obviously Surigao Strait, Samar, and Cape Engano. But if you're going to do the whole thing, then you also kind of have to do Sibian Sea. And given that you can make an entire movie out of the sinking of Yamato, which took less time than the sinking of Musashi, and Musashi got sunk at Sibian Sea, plus you've got the various cruisers that are torpedoed on the way as well, I think if you were going to do Leyte Gulf, then you'd probably have to do it as maybe at least a 6, maybe 10-part high-budget mini-series rather than a movie, unless you want the movie to go on for half a day. As far as Samar is concerned, again, I don't think anyone's done a Samar movie. I'm vaguely aware that there have occasionally been attempts to do a Samar movie, because obviously it is a really good story and would actually fit into a decent length film. However, without giving too much away, from what I've heard from various sources, one of the bigger stumbling blocks to doing a Battle of Samar movie for people who have tried to do one in the past is that the film execs who have proposed the idea have tried to change too much of the movie, which has then upset some of the families of some of the more notable, well, not even necessarily survivors, but people who fought at Samar, and they in turn have refused to assist in a movie which they don't think reflects what happened to their friends, relatives, ancestors, etc. accurately enough, which is, fair enough if you think Hollywood's going to besmirch the character of a family, friend, or relative. Why would you help them out? And finally, Corvus asks, I was just reading an article in Scientific American about late Cretaceous armoured dinosaurs. The various osteoderms, spikes and horns had been thought to be just bone, but recently they found an ankylosaur specimen that was preserved well enough to show a layer of keratin on top, as much as 40% of the thickness of the underlying bone. The authors commented on how this was highly effective, being a strong but brittle material with a weaker but tougher layer on top. This made me think of naval armour, but that's the other way round, the hardened faces on top of a softer and more ductile layer. Was there ever any consideration to doing it dinosaur style, turning it around so the harder layer was on the inside? Not as far as I'm aware, and I think that's because the principles are working very differently. Because if you are talking about organic armour on a living thing, well, as anyone who's broken a bone can probably attest to, yes, if your bone is damaged, it can heal, but it's never going to quite heal the same way it was before. Whereas keratin, stuff your hair and your nails is made out of, that not only regrows a lot quicker, but because it tends to sort of wholesale replace itself over time anyway, even a fairly deep gouge or cut, etc., can replace itself, relatively speaking, quickly. And also, the things that it's going to be attacked by, for the most part, are going to be of approximately the same strength, if we're talking about claws, because they'll probably have a keratin sheath as well. And even for teeth, the relative strength, yes, the teeth will be stronger, but it will absorb a certain amount of the damage before you get down to the bone layer. So that makes a lot of sense from an organic perspective. However, when you're talking about a battleship's perspective against an incoming shell, if you flipped the armour around, it would still have some protective value, obviously, but the extremely high velocity, extremely high energy, and extremely hard armour-piercing shell against the softer backing material would go through it relatively easily and not actually lose a huge amount of energy compared to the energy it needs to break through the face-hardened layer. So when it arrives at the face-hardened layer, which is now at the back, it might, in very, 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 very niche circumstances, not quite have the energy to break through, but even if it is in that case, you're still probably going to get a huge amount of spalling off of the back, which may then lead to a failure, even if the energy for the shell to break through itself wasn't there. And in all other cases, the shell breaks through, assuming it had enough energy in the first place, and then you get massive, very sharp shards of very brittle armour flying around, as well as the shell itself, which isn't very good. Whereas the way that naval armour obviously works normally is that the hardened shell breaks up on the hardened faceplate, hopefully, and even if it doesn't, then the idea obviously is the outer faceplate massively reduces the amount of energy of the incoming shell, and then the weaker, softer backplate can absorb what's left and, critically, hold together the shattered outer face and, stop
the major fragments coming through, hopefully. So for a system that is just designed to absolutely break, essentially under the impact, but protect the internals, then the way naval armour works is best. But it's an absolutely sacrificial system, which obviously doesn't work quite so well for organic things, where you don't really want to be permanently missing what could be a fairly vital part of your body going forward. And that brings us to an end to this week's Drydock. It's gone on for quite a while. Thank you very much for listening, everyone, and see you again in another video.